His fingers tap restlessly on the grand desk, a black-haired man lost in thought, while a green-haired boy waits. The green-haired boy remains silent, his expression unreadable. Seated on his throne, Duke Klaus de Balthazar pauses, acknowledging the boy's summons. With a sudden thump, the Duke pins the startled boy to the wall. Leaning close, the Duke murmurs that he's curious about something, leaving the boy flustered. The Duke sniffs the boy's hair, then angrily questions him about wearing a forbidden perfume. The boy denies wearing any perfume, but the Duke scoffs, reminding him of his servitude to pay a debt. The Duke reveals his name, Antonio de Hessink, and vows to uncover the boy's hidden secrets. Trapped against the wall, the green-haired person panics, wondering if their secret has been discovered. Their true fear surfaces in a frantic thought. Has he realized they're a woman? The Duke grabs their chin, demanding they stop looking away. His intense gaze deepens as he claims their resistance only intrigues him more, making them question if he's bisexual. The disguised woman reflects that this was the exact situation she tried to avoid, fearing the novel's original plot is inevitable. In a memory, a bottle shatters as a long-haired, green-haired woman curses from the floor. A disheveled man with brown hair points accusingly at a black-haired woman, demanding to know where the rum is, calling her Roselia. The black-haired woman is identified as Roselia de Hessink, the adopted daughter of the house. The man continues his tirade, raging about the money their father supposedly left for Roselia. He grabs her, desperate for something to sell, as a narration describes the family's fall and his pathetic succession, while Rosalia retrieves a dagger. With a grim look, Roselia holds the dagger, her patience clearly at an end. As the narration condemns the man, he panics at the sight of the knife. Roselia decides it's time to get rid of him and swings with a whoosh. The man lets out a sharp cry of pain. With a slash, the long green hair of the protagonist is cut away. Now with short hair, she holds the severed locks and the dagger, declaring it's almost time. The brown-haired man stares in stunned silence. He walks away, defeated, as the newly shorn woman stands before the fireplace. Looking back over his shoulder, the man spits a curse at her. The short-haired woman, still in a dress, admits to feeling awkward. The narrator explains that Antonio will never return, as he shivers alone in a cold, dark alley. Creditors grab Antonio from the shadows, demanding he pay his gambling debts. A delicate hand touches a cracked window pane. Fully disguised as a young man, she peers out the broken window. A memory of the novel's original Roselia de Hessink surfaces, explaining her role as a background character sold to the Duke. Straightening her cravat, she reflects on the 3 years she has spent preparing for this moment, knowing the Duke will try to hire her. She recalls the original Roselia foolishly falling for the Duke. Determined, she resolves to find another way to pay the debt, starting by avoiding the Duke's attention. Whoosh! The scene shifts to an ivy-covered estate, as a voice confirms it's the correct address. Duke Klaus learns from his aide that the Hessink estate's value won't cover the debt, which the son, Antonio, inherited. As the door creaks open, the aide reports that the daughter recently died of illness. The Duke remarks what a pity. A voice greets Duke Klaus de Balthazar, startling him. The green-haired protagonist introduces himself as Antonio de Hessink, vowing to never fall for the Duke. Stepping forward, she formally presents herself to the Duke as Antonia de Hessink. The Duke gives her a silent, appraising stare. Whoosh! The Duke suddenly turns his back, leaving Antonio surprised. Antonio gives a nervous laugh, acknowledging the Duke's formidable reputation. The Duke turns back, stating plainly that he has come to collect the debt her father owes him. He informs her that even selling the mansion leaves an outstanding debt of 3,000 varangs. The Duke crosses his arms, waiting for a response. Antonio offers a slight smile, calmly agreeing that paying now seems impossible. With a slight bow, Antonio concedes the point, but defiantly adds, however. Pointing a finger, Antonio makes their case, while the Duke listens with a questioning look. With a sparkle, Antonio confidently declares they will pay back all 3,000 varangs. Antonio stands firm, pointing at the unimpressed Duke with an air of determination. A chill runs down the Duke's spine as he questions how, reminding Antonio that they are a broke, incapable drunk who dropped out of the academy. Antonio flinches, admitting to himself that he isn't wrong. Stepping forward, Antonio reveals they have a secret weapon and haven't been wasting their life away. The Duke crosses his arms, skeptically asking if they truly have an ace up their sleeve. Antonio smiles, confidently confirming that they do, and begins to reveal their weapon. Their weapon is revealed to be their knowledge from the novel, symbolized by a glowing book and gears. As an example, they know the future location of a yet-to-be-discovered Manistone mine. They also know the location of a sunken ship filled with treasure. However, the easiest path to wealth, they conclude, is through art. They recall how the novel's heroine amassed her fortune by discovering unknown artists. Realizing they must find the valuable art before she does, Antonio announces their plan to use street information and their own eye for talent to buy the pieces. The Duke raises a valid point, asking how they plan to get the money to buy the art in the first place. Antonio cheerfully agrees, acknowledging that every business venture needs capital, much to the Duke's annoyance. They then reveal that this is precisely what they wanted to ask the Duke about. With a hopeful smile, Antonio asks the Duke to lend them just 20 varangs. The Duke stares in silent, looming disbelief at the audacious request. Letting out a tired sigh, he clarifies that their plan is to borrow even more money from him. Antonio gives a bright and cheerful yes in response. The Duke narrows his eyes, silently processing the bold proposal. Antonio makes their final pitch, promising to turn 20 varangs into 500 in only 2 months. Believing the deal is done, Antonio bows deeply and thanks the Duke for his generosity. The Duke looks away, adding a condition with a grim "however." As 2 large men appear, the Duke reveals he has a condition for the loan. Startled, Antonio wonders when the 2 imposing men entered the room. With a grab, the men seize Antonio's arms from both sides. The 2 men easily lift the struggling Antonio off the floor. Being dragged away, Antonio panics and insists again that they will pay back the debt. The Duke walks ahead, coolly addressing them by their name, Antonio. Turning back with a smirk, the Duke asks how he could possibly trust them not to run away. Held firmly by the guards, Antonio nervously admits that he has a point. As Antonio struggles, the Duke acknowledges their promise, but expresses his lingering doubt. A look of shock crosses Antonio's face as they realize they completely overlooked the issue of trust. Before the fireplace, the Duke agrees to trust Antonio this one time, but adds another condition. He declares that Antonio will stay under his watch until the debt is repaid, binding them to him. The Duke flashes a handsome, satisfied smile. As Antonio struggles and protests the unfairness, the Duke coldly states it's because he said so and orders him dragged away. The scene shifts to a bright day as Antonio thinks back on their vow to never become a maid. Instead, they've become the Duke's male servant, carried helplessly across the estate grounds. Defeated, Antonio hangs their head and wonders what has become of their life. They arrive at a breathtakingly grand and sprawling ducal mansion. An aide shows Antonio to their quarters, which they note seems far too luxurious for a servant. Whoosh! The aide reveals an opulent room, explaining that Antonio's circumstances are special. Antonio looks back at the aide, confused by the special treatment. The aide explains they have been given a room very close to the Duke's office, shocking Antonio. Giving a thumbs up, the aide cheerfully says the room is a 5-second walk from the Duke's, making Antonio sweat nervously. As the aide offers a tour, Antonio reluctantly agrees, thinking at least they have a private room. While walking, Antonio suddenly feels a tightness in their chest. The suffocating feeling intensifies as someone down the hall shouts, "My lady," causing Antonio to dash forward in alarm. With a sudden catch, Antonio saves a falling, white-haired woman. Holding her, Antonio stares, a thought beginning to form. FWIP. The woman turns in their arms, impatiently asking how long they plan to hold her. Now standing apart, the woman notes she hasn't seen the flustered Antonio before. Dash, a man rushes in shouting for "my lady" as Antonio realizes her status. Antonio privately wonders if the woman is Duke Klaus's sister. The woman clears her throat, getting Antonio's undivided attention. She smiles, admitting that she likes pretty things and finds Antonio to be pretty. Pointing decisively, the woman declares her intentions to a very confused Antonio. The lady grandly announces that she is taking Antonio as her personal attendant, an il domestico. Both Antonio and the other man react in shock to her sudden declaration. The narrator explains that an il domestico is a handsome servant kept as an accessory. An example shows an aristocratic lady accompanied by her male attendant. Remembering the trend, Antonio begins to politely decline the offer. An older maid rushes in, startling the lady, who flinches with a "Yikes!" The lady points, ordering Antonio to attend her meeting tomorrow as he tries to stammer a protest. The older maid runs past them, demanding the lady stop right there. The lady dashes away from the maid, who chases her for a skin treatment. The man notes how lucky Antonio is, but Antonio internally rejects the idea, uninterested in the role. Flop. An exhausted Antonio collapses onto the bed in their new room. Lying down, Antonio laments having to deal with a rich girl while remembering their promise to the Duke. A dark thought surfaces, fearing the Duke will eat them alive if they fail. Antonio wonders where Alejandro is with the promised money. Feeling uncomfortable on their first night, Antonio impatiently waits to rest. Antonio clutches their chest, contemplating loosening their painful bindings. Sitting on the bed, Antonio questions why Alejandro promised to bring the money today. Antonio stretches out, finally unbound and feeling much better. Reflecting on the suffocating bindings, Antonio walks across the room. Relaxing in bed, Antonio feels certain no one would visit so late. A hand silently turns the doorknob from the outside. Knock, knock, knock. The sudden sound startles Antonio, who realizes they spoke too soon. Antonio stands in shock, their loose shirt revealing their unbound state. Scramble, Antonio frantically tries to reapply their bindings, shouting, "H, hold on." Dudon, hastily wrapped, Antonio grimaces as the knocking continues. Antonio pauses nervously before finally opening the door. The Duke stands at the door, leaving Antonio stammering in surprise. FWIP, the Duke holds out a letter as Antonio wonders what to do. Grown, Antonio uses a large vase of flowers to hide their chest. Antonio claims they were moving the vase, which the Duke questions given the late hour. While the Duke waits, Antonio strains under the vase's weight. The Duke asks why they don't just put it down, but Antonio refuses, then asks what he wants. Antonio nervously asks the Duke to place the letter inside the vase. Peeking over the flowers, Antonio watches him with anxious eyes. Amused, the Duke questions the odd request as Antonio insists, straining under the weight. The Duke places the letter in the vase, reminding Antonio of their promise before Antonio calls out to him again. With a strained smile, Antonio politely asks the Duke to close the door since their hands are full. The Duke turns back from the hallway, looking at the peculiar scene. Creak, he obliges, closing the door as Antonio laughs nervously. Clack, the door shuts, leaving Antonio finally alone. Flop, Antonio drops the vase and collapses, their souls seeming to float out as they think they might die from stress. At a lavish tea party, Clausette entertains guests while Antonio stands by. While Clausette smiles warmly, Antonio internally wonders how he got there. A flashback reveals Clausette declaring him ready before pulling a flustered Antonio into a carriage. He reflects that he's already busy enough just trying to make money. One of the ladies asks Clausette about her handsome new attendant, Flinch. Clausette proudly asks if he's handsome, startling a stoic Antonio. The other ladies enthusiastically agree, praising his looks and unique green hair. One lady continues, commenting on his delicate jawline. Flinch. Clausette continues to boast, causing Antonio another jolt of surprise. She playfully asks Antonio for confirmation, putting him on the spot. He gives a charming response, making the other ladies swoon over his voice. Antonio decides to play along, hoping the ladies might become future investors. A guest presents a gift box, asking the others to look inside. Clack. The box opens to reveal a floral hairpiece, which the owner doesn't know how to use. Antonio steps in, identifying the accessory as a hair vine. All eyes at the table turn to him, intrigued by his knowledge. He politely offers to assist the lady with the hair vine. With a practiced hand, he elegantly styles her hair. Wow! The lady admires her new look, impressed as he explains its popularity. Clausette and the other guests watch in stunned silence. The other two ladies clamor excitedly, asking him to style their hair too. Loom! Clausette's stern voice cuts in, calling his name and startling him. She firmly declares her turn is first, and he lets out a quiet sigh of relief. Clop. Later in a carriage, he observes a humming Cosette, noting her good mood. He reveals he learned hairstyling for his sister, who passed away recently. Clausette's eyes well up with tears as she hears his sad story. She clenches her fists, furious that the Duke bought him after such a loss. Crying, she calls the Duke a villain and offers to help pay off his debt. He warns her the debt is large, but she insists, boasting of her wealth. Drip. He states the amount is 5,000 varangs, and she freezes in shock. She struggles to comprehend the amount as he knows it's a fortune even for her. He explains he owes 3,200 now and reassures her that he has a plan. Wish. Clausette enthusiastically proposes a new deal. He'll work for her 3 days a week, promising handsome pay. She secures his thanks and agreement. The carriage continues its journey through the cobblestone streets. Sigh. Back inside the carriage, Clausette lets out a heavy sigh. She turns to Antonio and offers a sincere apology. Flinch. He recoils slightly, confused, and asking what she is sorry for. She apologizes as a member of the de Balthazar family for her brother's greed. He tries to refuse her apology, but she insists her brother's actions were wrong. Clunk. Gazing out the window, she vows her brother will pay for it someday. Antonio watches her in silence, his expression unreadable. He thinks to himself that her brother is the only family she has left too. She turns back to him with a bright, reassuring smile. She promises to protect him from her brother, as he is now her attendant. He accepts her offer, and they share a moment of newfound camaraderie. Their carriage arrives back at the sprawling de Baltazar estate. The white-haired lady steps forward, confidently telling Antonio they are an aristocrat in their own right. But they look back in confusion. She takes the Duke's arm as they walk together, but he remains silent and impassive. The Duke and the lady share a moment of quiet, pensive silence. Turn! The Duke walks away with Antonio, instructing them to go, leaving the lady behind. Antonio bows obediently to the Duke. Chills. The Duke icily asks if they've made 500 varangs yet, sarcastically noting they seem to have too much free time, much to Antonio's irritation. A servant approaches, carrying a large vase of red roses. The Duke reminds Antonio that every second counts if they want to earn 500 varangs. Stepping forward, Antonio explains they couldn't refuse the lady's request, vowing to take care of themselves. Bow. With a quick bow and an internal geez, Antonio takes their leave. Determined not to be scared, Antonio turns and dashes away, accidentally colliding with the servant holding the vase. Splash, the vase topples over, sending water and flowers flying. Antonio freezes in shock as water erupts all around them. The white-haired lady gasps in alarm, shouting, "Antonio! Flop!" Done. Antonio collapses to their knees on the wet floor as the stunned servant holds the empty vase. Drenched and apologetic, Antonio insists it's nothing. Dash. The lady and the servant rush to Antonio's side, and she anxiously asks if they are hurt. Standing nearby, Antonio apologizes again, but the Duke coldly tells them to watch where they're going. As Antonio stands to go get changed, the lady calls them a pain, while the servant sobs in the background. Step, step. The Duke suddenly asks if they are hurt, then points out what looks like bandages under their shirt. Antonio looks down in horror at their soaked and now revealing shirt. Gasp! They realize their chest bindings are visible. Wish. As the Duke repeats his question, Antonio hastily crosses their arms, trying to hide their chest. The Duke presses further, asking why they would be wearing bandages if they aren't hurt. Sweat. Antonio begins to sweat as the lady looks on with a calculating expression. The lady remains silent, her gaze sharp and observant. Bottom, bottom, bottom. Antonio's heart pounds in panic as they wonder what to do. The lady suddenly declares that Antonio is hurt, and it was because of her. Both the Duke and Antonio are stunned by her unexpected claim. FWIP. The lady calmly gestures toward herself. She lies, explaining that Antonio hurt their back while helping her after she slipped getting out of a carriage. The Duke eyes her story with suspicion, while Antonio marvels at her ability to lie so smoothly. The Duke thanks his sister, revealing her name to be Clausette. As Clausette looks on, the Duke apologizes on her behalf, while Antonio nervously wonders if she noticed the truth. Clausette angrily asks why he's apologizing for her, before the Duke turns his attention back to Antonio, asking if they're okay. Clausette scoffs at her brother's sudden display of concern, but he ignores her, his focus remaining on Antonio. Grr. Foosh. The two siblings glare at each other like dueling tigers, trapping a nervous Antonio in the middle of their fiery standoff. Jolt! The Duke's voice cuts through the tension, startling Antonio, who stammers a reply. Looking down at them, the Duke advises Antonio to take better care of himself. Sweat. Antonio nervously agrees while Clausette scoffs at her brother's typical behavior. Wish. Without another word, the Duke turns and walks away. Clausette fumes over her brother's words as Antonio cautiously addresses her. Antonio looks at Clausette and asks why she helped them. Clausette simply turns away, with a silent, cross-armed pout. Antonio waits patiently for her to speak. She reminds Antonio of her promise to protect them, but Antonio points out she doesn't know the real reason for the bandages. Clausette insists it doesn't matter, only that they were in a tough spot, and Antonio's heart twinkles with gratitude for her kindness. Blushing, Antonio quickly dismisses the moment, telling her to never mind. Clausette invites Antonio to a tea party, asking them to just stand around looking handsome, which they agree to with some confusion. Dash. Urging them to get changed, Clausette sends a cold Antonio running to their room. Clack. The scene shifts to the bright, scenic town of Algrisha. A carriage rattles along at a brisk pace. Antonio gets out of the carriage, offering a polite, "Thank you." Looking at the sky with a gentle smile, Antonio thinks, this is... Antonio arrives in the bustling market of Algrisha, the location of the first painting. A flashback explains that the novel's female protagonist discovered her first art piece here. This discovery marked the beginning of her patronage for unknown artists. Glancing, Antonio scans the marketplace, searching for an art dealer. A fishmonger calls out to the handsome fellow, and Antonio laughs nervously. Walking through the crowd, Antonio is shocked to find no art merchants. Wondering if it's too early, a vegetable vendor asks if they need help finding something. Antonio asks about an art seller, and the woman mentions a man named Arbello. The vendor sadly explains that she hasn't seen Arbello for a while. What? Antonio asks why, but the woman has no idea. The woman suggests Antonio visit Arbello's home to find out more. Following her directions, Antonio looks for a house with a painting of roses on the door. Antonio approaches a secluded house, wondering if this is the right place. Standing before the silent house, Antonio thinks this can't be right according to the novel. Determined, Antonio steals himself, certain Arbello must be here. Bang, Antonio pounds on the door, calling for the man inside. The door creaks open, and a gruff, long-haired man asks, who is making the racket? The artist, Arbello Hunter, angrily demands to know who Antonio is and why they are knocking. Antonio's eyes widen as they spot a familiar painting inside the house. Whoosh! The painting depicts a blonde woman and child in a field of white flowers. Antonio smiles, realizing this is where the Crown Princess's collection began, and correctly identifies Mr. Arbello Hunter. Antonio explains they came after seeing his work, but Arbello just scowls in silence. Slam! Just as Antonio begins to introduce himself, Arbello slams the door shut. Stunned, Antonio wonders why it was so different from the novel, where the female lead bought it instantly. Antonio bangs on the door again, accusing him of discrimination and pleading for him to talk. Peek, a small blonde girl cautiously peeks out from behind the corner of the house. Antonio crouches down to get a better look at the small, sad-looking child. Antonio gently asks the girl what she's doing there, all alone. The girl states her mom told her not to talk to strange men, making Antonio remember their disguise. Antonio apologizes for frightening her and turns to leave, just as the girl sadly wonders why her mommy isn't back. Hearing her, Antonio stops in their tracks. Antonio looks back, sensing that something is very wrong, a rundown house and a neglected child. Antonio feels a growing unease. Meanwhile, the Duke and Alejandro finally arrive in a different part of the village. Now in Algricia, Alejandro admits he doesn't understand the Duke's plan. He questions the Duke's intention to build a school in such a small village. The Duke explains Algricia's strategic importance as a flourishing crossroads of commerce, surprising Alejandro. He reveals his plan to build a school for the middle and working classes. Impressed, Alejandro praises the Duke's insight, which the Duke attributes to being top of his class. As the Duke walks through the village, Antonio is visible in the distant crowd. The solution, Antonio thinks, was simple after all as they look at two wigs. Antonio stands before a shop window, considering the wigs. A close-up highlights a beautiful, long, blonde wig. The scene returns to Arbello's secluded, overgrown house. Glug. Inside, Arbello drinks heavily while the little girl sits alone before he realizes he's run out of wine. The little blonde girl looks up in confusion, asking, huh. She looks out the window, seeing a memory of a blonde woman in a sunlit field. A vision of the beautiful blonde woman in a green and white dress appears. Mommy, the little girl Erilyn shouts as she runs for the door, startling her father Arbello. Evelyn rushes into a tight hug, joyfully crying mommy. The blonde woman, Antonio in disguise, looks down anxiously. Done! The little girl continues to cling to Antonio. Arbello rushes out, apologizing and telling Erilyn that the woman is not her mother. As Arbello looks on with a heavy heart, Antonio realizes the only difference between them and the female protagonist was their gender, as the three of them share a quiet moment outside the house. A flashback shows Arbello comforting a younger, wiggling Erilyn who cries for her mommy, explaining that his wife recently passed away. Back in the present, Antonio thinks they suspected as much and tells Arbello it's okay. Antonio recalls that in the novel, Arbello meets the protagonist at the market, seeing his late wife in her. Having anticipated this, Antonio wore a blonde wig, which proved effective as Erilyn cries out, Mommy! FWIP. Antonio gently holds Erilyn's face, asking if they look like her mother, and the girl pauses. Looking closer, Erilyn sadly realizes, you're not mommy? Sniffle. Antonio apologizes for misleading her, but the tearful girl says it's okay. Evelyn explains her mommy has pretty blue eyes, and Antonio, whose eyes are green, quietly accepts this. The little girl turns to her father, heartbreakingly asking when her mommy is coming back. She wonders if her mother will return if she's a good girl, leaving Arbello devastated. Arbello apologizes for involving Antonio, who reassures him that it's an understandable reaction for a child. Arbello asks what brought them here, as Antonio feels a pang of guilt before he asks if they came to buy his painting. Antonio is stunned that he knew, and Arbello continues, saying he wants to buy the painting. Arbello explains that visitors are rare, and correctly deduces that they are with the man who visited earlier. He invites Antonio inside to talk, and they smile gratefully. Steam, steam. A hot mug of tea sits on a wooden table. Inside the humble home, Arbello apologizes for his poor hospitality, but Antonio insists the tea is lovely. Sip. Antonio calmly takes a drink from the mug. The room is dominated by a shining, framed painting of a woman and child as Arbello sits in thoughtful silence. As Erilyn hums and eats, Antonio catches themselves staring at the painting and says, "Oh yes." Arbello asks about their relationship with Antonio, and they calmly reply, "He's my brother." Nom. Relieved he doesn't suspect they are the same person, Antonio watches Erilyn enjoy her food. Nom, nom. Arbello explains again that his wife recently passed away as his daughter continues eating. Pointing to the painting of his wife and daughter, he admits he hasn't drawn anything since finishing it. He explains that seeing Erilyn's reaction earlier made him realize something important. He recalls the image of his daughter clinging to a stranger, desperate for her mother. Arbello realizes his daughter must be suffering more than he is. He closes his eyes with regret, admitting he failed to notice her pain. Confirming their request, Arbello looks at Antonio and makes a decision. "I will sell it." Surprised, Antonio asks if he is sure, noting how precious the painting seems to be. Arbello admits he has been selfishly trapped by the painting, while his daughter asks why he isn't eating. He reflects on how he foolishly let himself be consumed by a memory, realizing it's still just a painting. He gently pats Erilyn's head, promising to use the money to take better care of her. Hee. The little girl beams with happiness under her father's touch. Arbello sincerely thanks Antonio and their brother for helping him see clearly. Clench. Antonio thinks that he would have recovered on his own eventually, and makes him a promise. Skeptical, Arbello asks how they can be so certain of his future. Antonio smiles with absolute confidence, assuring him that many will recognize the painting's value. They predict he will become a famous artist sponsored by royalty, declaring this is only the beginning. Clack, clack. The scene transitions back to the bright, colorful streets of the village. Dressed as a woman, Antonio carries a large canvas, determined to complete his task. Wham! He collides with someone and cries out in surprise. Flop. He falls to the ground and looks up to see the Duke walking away. Turn. The Duke turns back, asking if he's all right. Gasp. He freezes, shocked to see the Duke's face. He looks up from the ground at the Duke and his men, frantically asking what he's doing here. While the Duke asks again if he is okay, he panics internally, hiding his face with the canvas and wondering what to do. Wish. He stands up, keeping his face hidden as the Duke questions him. The Duke begins to ask if he's injured. Dash. Before he can finish, Antonio flees, shouting that he's fine. The Duke's attendant asks if he knows the fast-running woman, but the Duke says he doesn't think so. As his attendant questions him, the Duke gives a knowing smirk. The scene transitions to the magnificent de Balthazar estate. Now dressed as himself, Antonio walks through the hall, noting that nothing has changed. Step. He lets out a relieved sigh, unable to believe he ran into the Duke in disguise. FWIP. Just as he wonders where the Duke is, the man himself opens the doors. Jolt! The Duke's voice startles Antonio as he asks if he has business with him. Haha. Antonio laughs nervously, quickly denying it. The Duke eyes him suspiciously, stating that he has business with Antonio, however. Gasp. Antonio tenses as the Duke summons him inside to discuss something. Inside the office, Antonio is stunned as the Duke asks him to confirm that his sister, Roselia de Hessink, is dead. Shaken, Antonio asks why His Grace is bringing this up. The Duke steps closer, explaining that he met someone earlier today. He reveals that the woman he met looked just like Antonio. The Duke's gaze intensifies as he prepares to say one more thing. Leaning in, the Duke asks why he is so quiet, noting a familiar scent. Antonio sweats, his expression a mask of pure anxiety. He stammers, claiming he has no idea what the Duke is talking about. Clench. The Duke's hand tightens into a fist as he directly asks if Roselia is truly dead. With arms crossed, the Duke sternly demands the truth. Antonio realizes the Duke doesn't suspect the woman was him, as the Duke coldly states that a smuggled Roselia would be a net loss for him. Antonio thinks grimly that this is just how the Duke has always been. A flashback describes the Duke as a callous man who used Roselia's love and cast her aside. The memory darkens, recalling that Roselia's tragic story ended at the guillotine. A vision of a black-haired Roselia shows her being led to her execution. Antonio rebukes the Duke for his insensitivity, then explains that he and Roselia weren't related by blood. He recalls how Roselia's mother married into his family when they were children. The Duke listens to his explanation, and Antonio simply replies, I see. Turning away, the Duke apologizes, admitting he must have been mistaken. Bow. The Duke dismisses him, and Antonio bows respectfully. Freeze. Just as he turns to leave, the Duke's voice stops him in his tracks. Tap. The Duke warns him that if this is a ruse, he will uncover the deception. After Antonio leaves, the Duke wonders if a familiar scent threw him off his judgment. The scene shifts to a quiet, sunlit drawing room. Antonio stands alone before a door, lost in thought. Yay! He collapses to his knees, celebrating his narrow escape. Groan. Still trembling, he reflects on the Duke's callousness, glad he faked his own death. He carefully removes the cloth from the painting he acquired. Smiling with a slight blush, he looks at the painting, thinking now all he has to do is sell it. Clop. A grand carriage makes its way through the city streets. Antonio ponders how to sell the newly acquired painting. In a carriage, Clausette asks a distracted Antonio what's on their mind. Clausette earnestly offers her help, needing Antonio to be focused for the day. Antonio laughs shyly as Clausette confidently insists she can help with anything. Blushing, Antonio explains they must meet the crown princess, a difficult task even for her. Clausette dismisses the problem as simple, leaving Antonio to ask pardon. Chuckle. She smiles slyly, asking Antonio if they know who is hosting today's tea party. Antonio gasps in realization as Clausette looks on with a satisfied smile. Ornate carriages arrive at a grand estate, revealed to be the home of the Marquis, the crown princess's relative. The beautiful garden and gazebo of the estate elicit an impressed wow. Antonio stands behind Aquilia de Herden, the crown princess's younger sister, as she admires the beautiful scenery. At the tea party, Aquilia and another lady compliment Antonio on their handsome looks and skillful hands. A gray-haired lady agrees that Antonio is handsome, but then scoffs disdainfully. The lady, thinking men should be masculine, dismisses Antonio as frail, while Clausette glares from behind. Juicy de Belmonte judges Antonio, thinking they look like they'd break from a simple touch. Clausette angrily asks what she said, but Antonio calmly intervenes. Antonio walks over to the table where Joside and the other ladies are sitting. Antonio politely introduces himself and offers to style Lady Belmonte's hair. Blush. A flustered Lady Belmonte stammers in surprise at the sudden offer. Antonio knowingly thinks that scolds often crave affection and compliments her face shape. Datum. Lady Belmonte's heart pounds as she blushes at the unexpected flattery. Impressed by how quickly Antonio pacified her, Aquilia watches as Lady Belmonte hesitantly agrees. Clausette proudly tells Aquilia that Antonio also has a keen eye for aesthetics. FWIP, Antonio begins styling Lady Belmonte's hair as she notes their quick hands. Clausette boasts that Antonio's talent is even recognized by the infamous Duke Balthazar, shocking the other ladies. Lady Belmonte mentions the crown princess's interest in art and asks Aquilia about it. Aquilia confirms her sister has been searching for art, but hasn't liked anything yet. Seizing the opportunity, Clausette suggests Antonio show the crown princess their newly acquired painting. Ha ha ha, Aquilia loves the idea and promises to tell her sister about the painting immediately. Clausette gives a hopeful thumbs up to Antonio behind Aquilia's back. FWIP, Antonio returns a happy, blushing thumbs up, their plan a success. The scene shifts to the magnificent and sprawling royal palace. Inside, Antonio nervously holds the painting, thrilled to finally meet the crown princess. Knock knock, a servant announces Duke Balthazar's servant, and a voice grants them entry. Clunk. As the doors open, Antonio enters, knowing the novel's protagonist is inside. A woman in a beautiful purple gown offers a graceful welcome. Standing in a vast, book-lined room, Antonio nervously addresses the royal highness. The elegant, blonde-haired crown princess is revealed in her full splendor. She calls out Antonio's name, who looks up, completely starstruck by her presence. Bo! Antonio bows deeply, in a flustered apology for their days. Overjoyed to finally meet her, Antonio blushes as the crown princess bids them to rise. The crown princess explains that Clausette's high praise has made her eager to see the painting. Antonio eagerly hands the wrapped painting over to a waiting servant. Russell, the servant, unwraps the painting and places it on an easel. The crown princess silently studies the painting with a thoughtful expression. Antonio waits nervously, wondering why she remains silent for so long. The crown princess finally breaks the silence, beginning to share her thoughts on the artwork. Gazing at the image of a mother and child, she remarks on its incredible warmth. Gently touching the frame, she says she can almost feel the woman's emotions. FWIP. Her fingers trace the edge of the painting in a moment of quiet connection. Nice. Antonio proudly announces the artist's name, Arbello Hunter M. Sweat. The Crown Princess thanks Antonio for the introduction as they nervously accept her praise. The Crown Princess then asks Antonio for a favor, piquing their curiosity. She explains that since she cannot travel freely, it is difficult to find the art she truly seeks. Because she is confined to the palace, her search for great art is limited. Placing her trust in Antonio's judgment, she offers generous compensation for their help. Antonio blushes and enthusiastically accepts the royal commission. Before they begin, the Crown Princess moves to her desk to pay for the first painting. A servant presents a tray with a letter of payment to a grateful Antonio. Gasp! Antonio is stunned to see the payment is 1,000 varangs, double what they paid. The Crown Princess explains the payment is for both the art and Antonio's service, entrusting them to deliver the sponsorship. Blushing, Antonio is overjoyed, realizing they can truly help Arbello now. Suddenly, a man's voice announces that Duke Balthazar's servant has arrived. A blonde man in a military uniform barges in, surprising Antonio and the Crown Princess. Bow. The intruder greets the princess while Antonio respectfully bows. A flashback describes the intruder's intense golden eyes and ferocious nature. The narration reveals he emotionally torments the princess, but will later regret his actions. The princess explains she was just asking about Clausette, but the blonde man is suspicious. The man, Crown Prince Esteban, smirks, accusing her of conspiring with the Duke behind his back. Memory reveals the Crown Princess and a young, dark-haired Klaus were once childhood friends. The two were best friends, sharing a close and happy bond, but their friendship fractured as she married the Crown Prince, leaving a somber Klaus behind. After the Crown Prince's arrival, the two friends began to drift apart. Back in the present, Crown Prince Esteban smirks condescendingly with his arms crossed. Sigh. She insists her inquiry was innocent, but he scoffs in disbelief. He cruelly suggests she is colluding with her family and the Duke to betray him. Seeing her guilty reaction, he presses on as Antonio pleads for him to stop. The Crown Prince coldly challenges Antonio, asking, "Or what?" Grab. He violently seizes the princess's wrist, comparing her torment to what his mother endured. The princess defiantly states she isn't weak, as Antonio recalls this scene from the novel. They remember this cycle of doubt and misunderstanding always led to tragedy. Whoosh. Remembering Klaus always appears at the worst time, Antonio steps in, telling the prince that's enough. Antonio braces himself, recognizing the inevitable arrival of another cliché. Snatch! Just then, Duke Klaus de Balthazar appears, grabbing the prince's hand off the princess. Duke Balthazar glares intently at the prince, stating coldly, "You're hurting her. Sweat, sweat." Antonio panics internally, dismayed to be caught in the middle of royal drama. Smirk. The Crown Prince seems amused by the Duke's dramatic entrance. Speak of the devil, the prince drawls, acknowledging the arrival of Duke Klaus de Balthazar. The Crown Prince mockingly comments on how funny the situation is. He sarcastically notes that seeing the Duke and Princess together makes him look like the villain. As the two men argue, a terrified Antonio wishes they would fight somewhere else. The Crown Princess finally shouts for them to stop. She threatens to boycott the diplomatic event, a move that seems to amuse the Crown Prince. The prince agrees to leave, admitting her absence would be a disaster. With a final chilling glance, he warns Duke Balthazar to stay away or face consequences for his family. Phew. Once he's gone, the Duke worriedly asks if the prince is still mistreating her. The princess snaps, telling the Duke to stay out of her affairs with the Crown Prince. The Duke finally notices Antonio and asks what they're doing here, startling them. The princess calmly lies, saying she summoned Antonio to ask about Clausette. As Antonio accepts her cover story, the Duke glares, ordering them to leave. Antonio apologizes and tries to leave as Duke Balthazar asks the princess about her wrist. Walking away, Antonio thinks they didn't want to be there anyway. Hey, the Duke calls out, stopping Antonio in their tracks as they silently curse his annoying behavior. Thump. Crown Prince Esteban suddenly blocks their path, demanding to know where they're going as Antonio tries to feign ignorance. Antonio silently fumes, wanting to go home and cursing their terrible luck. Antonio puts on a fake, cheerful demeanor to greet the prince, who menacingly asks if they want to die. The prince scornfully calls Antonio Balthazar's dog, while Antonio bristles at the insult. Grab. After they turn to face each other, the prince violently seizes Antonio's collar, shocking them. Flap, flap. Antonio panics as the prince declares he's taking them somewhere more private. Wincing in pain, Antonio tearfully begs the Royal Highness to let them go. The scene transitions to a bright, beautiful garden with a large fountain. Thud. Antonio is thrown hard against a stone wall. The prince smirks, now confident they won't be overheard, and demands to know if the Duke sent Antonio to spy on him. Whoosh! He pins Antonio to the wall, offering to spare their life for information, but they insist the Duke gave no such orders. The prince's expression darkens as he threatens Antonio for their silence. His gaze narrows as he focuses on Antonio, who looks up in surprise. Rise, standing up, Antonio briefly considers if this is an opportunity to betray the Duke's secrets. Instead, they apologize sincerely, insisting they are only on an errand and swearing it's the truth. The prince questions their story, and Antonio confirms it, thinking they lack the courage to lie. Huh, the prince says, looking down as he realizes he is holding Antonio's hand. He comments on their surprisingly slender wrists for a man, leaving Antonio speechless. The prince grows suspicious, thinking Antonio is far too thin and short to be a man. Holding their chin, he demands to know their name. Rumble. A chilling vision of a guillotine appears. A flashback shows a woman named Rosalia answering to the prince, who repeats her name thoughtfully. The prince deems her name unfitting for a traitor's dog and coldly orders her execution as she looks on in terror. Guards seize the condemned Rosalia as she desperately pleads for her grace to save her. Whoosh, the guillotine falls, and Antonio flinches in the present, horrified by the memory. The prince leans closer, again demanding to know Antonio's name. A narration reveals Crown Prince Estevan was responsible for Rosalia's death after she was caught stealing information for the Duke. Slip! Antonio pulls their hand away from the memory of the executed spy and nervously introduces himself as Antonio. The prince muses that Antonio is a good name. He adds that it doesn't suit them, but Antonio resolves to change their fate this time. The prince critically asks why they're so skinny, and Antonio explains it was due to childhood malnourishment. He then cruelly criticizes their short height, touching on one of Antonio's biggest insecurities. Bow. The prince finally dismisses them, and Antonio respectfully agrees to leave. Stepping away, Antonio vows with steely determination that they will not die like Rosalia. The two walk in opposite directions along a stone path. The crown prince pauses, looking back with a thoughtful and suspicious expression. The story returns to the grand and opulent estate of Duke Balthazar. Clunk. Back in the Duke's office, Antonio places the letter of payment on his desk. The Duke looks up from his work, surprised by Antonio's sudden entrance. Antonio smirks, proudly announcing they kept their promise and taunting the Duke about his surprise. Duke Balthazar concedes their success but immediately questions what they were doing with the crown princess. Slide, he pushes the payment forward, demanding a believable story about how Antonio approached the princess. The Duke sternly warns against using Her Highness, but Antonio quietly asks if it's wrong to use him instead. Taken aback, the Duke listens as Antonio defiantly states they will repay their debt on their own terms. Smirk, Antonio challenges him, asking if the method matters as long as he gets his money. Grab, in a flash, Duke Balthazar's hand shoots out and grips Antonio's collar. The Duke furiously warns Antonio to watch their tongue when speaking of the princess, but Antonio calmly insists she will not be harmed. Antonio warns the Duke not to make assumptions, promising to leave once their debt is paid. Grit. The Duke violently grabs Antonio's wrist, his expression hardening. Antonio accuses him of using and abandoning Rosalia, then demands to be released. They pull their hand back, condemning him for not protecting Rosalia when she was executed for his sake. The Duke glares down at the letter on his desk, thinking he won't lift a finger to help Antonio. With a defiant glare, Antonio thinks that if someone must die for the princess, it should be the Duke. The scene shifts to a cheerful, light blue-haired girl in a purple dress holding a masquerade mask. T-esque, the girl calls Antonio's choice of mask mediocre and asks about their long face. Done. She astutely observes that Antonio looks like the head of a house drowning in debt, much to their surprise. FWIP, she leans in close, asking if Klaus upset them again, as Antonio blushes at her perceptiveness. She advises Antonio to ignore the Duke, explaining his temper worsens when the princess is involved. Holding up another mask, the girl wisely states, there's no use crying over spilled milk. After Antonio praises her wisdom, she suggests a different mask would look better on them. FWIP, she playfully holds a blue mask up to Antonio's face, asking them to try it on. Antonio declines, saying it's a woman's mask, but she eagerly offers to find them a matching dress. Flinch. A horrified Antonio quickly refuses the offer. The girl pouts, begging Antonio to wear a dress just once, admitting she's curious. She turns to her maid, Melda, who agrees and encourages Antonio to do it. Both women insist, pleading with Antonio to wear it just this one time. Sigh. Defeated, Antonio reluctantly agrees, and the young lady throws her arms up in a cheer of, yay! A hand is shown running through beautiful, long blonde hair. A figure with flowing blonde hair is revealed, now wearing an elegant, frilly pink dress. Clack! Antonio, now in full costume, nervously gets the attention of the girl and her maid. Gasp! The young lady and Melda are completely stunned by the transformation. Sparkle! Dressed as a woman with a mask and blonde wig, Antonio asks, "Are you happy now?" The lady and her maid are utterly delighted, exclaiming over how good Antonio looks. The girl wishes Antonio had been born a woman so she could have a portrait painted of them. Ha ha! She muses that while the blonde wig is nice, black hair would have suited Antonio even better. FWIP. FWIP. The excited girl begins tossing more masks at a bewildered Antonio. Done. She catches them in a hug, announcing her upcoming masquerade ball and her invitation to the crown princess. She invites Antonio to the party, but they assume they'd only be attending as a servant. "Excuse me," the lady says, offended, as Antonio nervously backpedals on the idea. She insists that with a mask, no one will recognize them. Arg! Antonio wants to change out of the dress first, but the girl shouts a firm no. She asks if they have a suit for the party, but Antonio suggests their current clothes are fine. Yell! Of course not, she shouts, flanked by two other maids. Wish. To Antonio's surprise, the maids swiftly grab their arms. Chills. As Antonio is held captive, the young lady laughs maniacally before a servant announces a gift from the Duke. The servant presents a box, which the girl opens to reveal an ornate hairpin. Thump! She carelessly tosses the gift aside as Antonio realizes the party is also her debut. The young lady sits on the sofa, her expression turning somber. She sadly remarks that her cold-hearted brother only cares about work and money, not his own family. She reveals he is also absent for their parents' death anniversary, leaving Antonio silently shocked. Scritch. The scene returns to Duke Balthazar, writing intently at his grand desk. He continues to write with his quill before pausing thoughtfully. Antonio's words about not making presumptions echo in his memory. The Duke lets out a heavy sigh, leaning back in his chair. Looking toward the door, he reluctantly gives permission to enter. Clack! Antonio enters the office, and the Duke immediately asks what they want. Antonio recalls their recent heated confrontation and feels a wave of awkwardness. The Duke impatiently asks why they're standing there, as Antonio relays Lady Balthazar's appreciation for his gift. Caw! An awkward silence hangs between them in the large office. The Duke astutely observes that Antonio looks like they have something to say. FWIP, Antonio cheekily corrects him, saying they actually have something to give him. He holds up a masquerade mask, and the Duke questions why he's being given it. Antonio looks down nervously, unsure how to explain. They explain that Lady Balthazar's birthday and debut party is a masquerade, in case he wasn't aware. The Duke confirms he knows, calling it the year's largest expense, while Antonio hopefully asks if he will attend. Sweat, Antonio feels his intense gaze and nervously answers when the Duke calls their name. The Duke gestures dismissively toward the mountains of paperwork piled on his desk. He insists he's too busy for a mere party and says his sister already knows this. As the Duke claims she knows why he works so hard, Antonio interjects that it's not just a birthday party. With a serious expression, Antonio declares that it is her debut. The scene flashes to a memory of a sparkling, crowded debutante ball. Antonio argues the debutante ball is important, but the Duke dismisses their concern, questioning what a new servant knows, and stating he and his sister, Clausette, have always fulfilled their duties separately. When Antonio questions his idea of duties, the Duke explains that he provides her with the best. He coldly states that providing for her is the best he can do, as Antonio thinks he truly knows nothing. A memory of the sad young lady appears as Antonio thinks that for her, the Duke is her only family. His expression hardening, the Duke coldly tells Antonio to get out. Antonio apologizes for wasting his time and agrees to leave as, clunk, the Duke remains seated alone. Opening the box with the mask, Antonio recalls their thought that the Duke is his sister's only family. The Duke stares at the mask on his desk, thinking Antonio's label of arrogant jerk was accurate. Flad, a man with reddish-brown hair, enters, announcing he has finished investigating the house of Baron Hessink as instructed. The man looks nervously at the report in his hands, unsure how to proceed. FWIP, he hands the document to the Duke, suggesting it's better if he sees it for himself. The Duke reads that Rosalia de Hessink's death certificate is a forgery, confirming his suspicions and wondering what secrets Antonio is hiding. The scene shifts to a grand ballroom decorated with golden roses for the masquerade. Ha ha! A masked lady in a yellow gown laughs elegantly. A beautifully set table is shown, ready for the party's guests. The Duke's sister, wearing a white gown, graciously thanks a guest as Antonio stands by her side. A masked woman in a green dress marvels at the amazing party, Noting Duke Balthazar spares no expense. Clack, her companion, agrees as she takes a confident step forward. A new woman named Joside de Belmont compliments Lady Clausette on the fabulous party. After Lady Balthazar thanks her, Joside introduces her older brother, who wishes the lady a happy birthday. The brother eagerly shakes Antonio's hand, mistaking them for the famous Duke Balthazar, much to their shock. Ha! The man admits he attended just to meet the Duke, commenting that Antonio is smaller than rumored, as they try to correct him. The Duke's sister quickly clarifies that the man is not her brother. Confused, Lady Belmonte's brother asks who Antonio is if not the Duke. Wish. The lady proudly introduces a happy Antonio as her partner for the evening. The man expresses his surprise, admitting he assumed the Duke would be her partner before asking when he will arrive. Joside quietly chides her brother for asking, while Antonio thinks the Duke is too busy to attend as his sister looks down sadly. Antonio glares as Joside apologizes, thinking they're trying to provoke his sister while other guests begin to whisper. Whisper, the guests gossip that the rumors of the siblings being at odds were true, predicting a bleak future for their house. Antonio looks up toward the grand staircase with concern, calling out, "My lady!" Standing beside the lady, Antonio is stunned, realizing the Duke has actually arrived. Murmur. Duke Balthazar makes a stunning entrance at the top of the stairs in a formal suit and mask. The Duke cuts an imposing, handsome figure in his masquerade attire. He calmly descends the stairs toward his sister and Antonio. A close-up shows the Duke's subtle smile beneath his mask. Looking at his sister, the Duke wishes her a happy 15th birthday. Dazed, the Duke looks at a masked Antonio and Clausette, all three of them momentarily stunned. FWIP. Clausette quickly grabs the Duke's arm. Chuckling, Clausette introduces guests to her dearest brother, much to the Duke's confusion. Wow! Clausette introduces Lord and Lady Belmonte, and the white-haired Lord enthusiastically greets the Duke. Antonio watches silently, wondering if his earlier persuasion of the Duke actually worked. Lord Belmonte gushes about finally meeting the Duke in person. Just as the Duke calls for Antonio, Lord Belmonte grabs him, wanting to ask a question. Antonio observes the group from a distance, thinking, "No way!" Antonio turns and walks away from the gathering. Lord Belmonte excitedly asks the renowned Duke for a sparring match someday. Glance. The white-haired Lord glances over at his companion, Lady Belmonte. Clausette proudly introduces the Duke as her brother, prompting an annoyed "ugh" from Lord Belmonte. Furious at the insolent wench, Lady Belmonte turns, plotting her revenge as she spots Antonio. A sinister smile spreads across Lady Belmonte's face. FWIP. A hand extends a glass of wine toward Antonio. Lady Belmonte raises her glass to Antonio with a simple "cheers." Grin. She takes a drink, a sly grin on her face. Clink. As they drink, Lady Belmonte silently vows revenge on Clausette de Balthazar. She privately promises to steal Clausette's most prized possession. Lady Belmonte laments her loneliness, then dismisses a waiter's suggestion to join her brother, instead inviting Antonio for a private chat. Antonio glances back at Clausette and the Duke before making his decision. The Duke stands with his eyes closed as a smiling Clausette looks on. Deciding to remove a threat, Antonio agrees to speak with the delighted Lady Belmonte. FWIP. In a quiet room, Antonio asks Lady Belmonte what she wishes to discuss. Tap, tap. She invites him to sit, reminding him that tonight he is a guest, not a servant. FWIP. He agrees to sit, but warns her he cannot stay for long. Taking a seat, he reminds her that he is Lady Clausette's partner for the evening. With a devious smirk, Lady Belmonte assures him that just a moment will be enough. The Duke notices Antonio is missing, and Clausette confirms he was just there. Lord Belmonte reveals he saw Antonio leave with his sister, shocking the Duke as Clausette wonders why he cares. Clausette falls silent, her expression unreadable. Glug, glug. As wine is poured, Lady Belmonte begins to speak to Antonio. Lady Belmonte confesses that she likes him, recalling the day he styled her hair. Blushing, she explains that she developed feelings for him that day. A nervous Antonio can only manage a strained, "Haha, I see." She leans closer, asking what he thinks of her. Splash, she jolts back, spilling his wine and refuses her offer to clean his shirt. Trying to stand, he insists he really must go. Bottom? His heart pounds as a sudden wave of weakness hits him. Bottom. He stumbles, wondering what's wrong as Lady Belmonte sinisterly asks if he feels a chill or warmth. Shove. She pushes him onto the couch, asking if he's feverish as he cries out her name in shock. Panicked, he realizes she must have drugged his wine as he finds himself unable to move. Lady Belmonte coldly admits she has always hated the arrogant Clausette. FWIP. She reaches for his mask, deriding Clausette's privileged background and asking if he agrees. She vows to take Clausette's favorite plaything, ignoring Antonio's pleas to be released. Ugh. Pinning him down, she gloats while he struggles, thinking that he's a woman too. Pop. A button on his shirt bursts open. Clack. The doors fly open to reveal a furious Clausette, startling Lady Belmonte. Flustered, Lady Belmonte demands to know why she barged in as a weakened Antonio calls out to his lady. Bam. Clausette strikes Lady Belmonte, who screams a curse in response. Ah! Lady Joside lets out a terrified scream. A furious Clausette stands over a collapsed and unconscious Antonio. From Antonio's hazy point of view, he sees Clausette striking Lady Joside. Flop. He loses consciousness and collapses onto a bed. Clausette, now in a simpler dress, anxiously calls out Antonio's name. Peek. He opens his eyes, weakly asking if it's Clausette as she checks on him. Antonio sits up with a headache, asking what happened as he recalls collapsing in Lady Joside's arms. He asks about Lady Joside, and Clausette coldly replies that she beat her and threw her out. An older attendant expresses shock at Lady Joside's actions, then asks Clausette what is wrong. Ah. Antonio jolts awake in a nightgown, frantically asking where his clothes are as Clausette points them out. He stares in horror at the discarded chest bindings. Clausette calls his binding impressive as he panics internally, realizing his secret is out and begging for a chance to explain. Antonio asks why they're so calm and if they knew he was a woman, which the attendant denies. He notes Clausette's lack of surprise, but she quickly insists she is shocked. She then asks what it matters, leaving him speechless. Clausette firmly states that his gender doesn't change who he is, moving Antonio with her acceptance. Blushing, Clausette admits she had hoped he was a woman and is glad it's true, earning his heartfelt thanks. Antonio looks down, beginning to apologize for his deception. Clausette reassures him, promising that she and her attendant, Melda, will keep his secret. After Antonio thanks them, Melda remarks that she always found him too pretty to be a man, which Clausette enthusiastically confirms. Ta-da! As Antonio reflects on her maturity, Clausette joyfully presents a new dress she had prepared for him. Clausette expresses her excitement for Antonio to try it on, while he nervously questions why she had such a dress ready. The scene transitions back to the bustling masquerade party. Turn. As the Duke starts to leave, Lord Belmonte stops him, insisting he has more questions. Lord Belmonte laughs that he could talk all night, as the Duke internally notes the man's persistence. Chatter. Another guest asks about the Duke's legendary feat against 20 knights, but he seems uninterested. The Duke overhears a guest wondering about the identity of a blonde woman with Clausette. The mysterious woman, Antonio in disguise, nervously adjusts her green mask. The Duke watches silently, his expression unreadable. Sweat. Clausette holds a nervous Antonio's hand, telling her not to worry. Clausette complains about not having servants' clothes and warns that Lady Joside will seek revenge. Sigh. Antonio says Clausette already handled it, but worries about being discovered. Clausette coldly threatens not to protect her next time, startling Antonio. Glitter. She pointedly asks if Antonio is going to abandon her birthday party now. Flinch. Clausette guilt trips her, saying she thought they were friends. She feigns disappointment, suggesting she was the only one who felt that way, and offers to leave her alone. Clausette pretends to cry to manipulate Antonio. Antonio points out that she's not actually crying, earning a silent, unimpressed stare from Clausette. Dep. The arrival of Crown Prince Estevan and Crown Princess Evelion is formally announced. The Duke turns to Clausette and immediately asks for Antonio's whereabouts. Clausette lies that Antonio felt unwell and went to his room, prompting a skeptical, really, from the Duke, glance. The Duke's eyes drift toward the grand staircase, where he spots a figure hiding. Antonio, in his blonde disguise, peeks out nervously from behind a column. Wish. The Crown Princess reacts with surprise, wondering what is happening. The Crown Prince and Princess smile as they greet the party. Clausette and the Duke bow respectfully, thanking the Royal Highnesses for attending. The Princess reassures Clausette they wouldn't miss her birthday, receiving a happy thanks in return. The Crown Prince greets the Duke, thanking him for last time and asking how he has been. The confused prince can only say, "Oh," as the Duke appears not to recognize him. From the stairs, a worried Antonio watches the interaction between the royals and the Duke. In the crowded ballroom, a disguised Antonio decides this is the perfect chance to run away. Flinch. A masked, blonde-haired man appears, calling their meeting a coincidence, as a startled Antonio turns around. Meanwhile, the Duke's arrival causes a guest to scream. The blonde-haired man formally greets Antonio, stating that they meet again. Antonio nervously addresses him as Your Royal Highness, while the man asks why they are being so formal on their second encounter. Bidum, bidum. Antonio's heart pounds as they feign ignorance, and the man dismisses the topic. Grab. He suddenly takes Antonio's hand, causing them to gasp in surprise. He pulls them into a dance, telling a shocked Antonio to just play along. As guests murmur, Antonio asks why he's dancing with them instead of the princess, but he tells them to be quiet and dance. Antonio inwardly fumes at his selfish, provocative behavior on the dance floor. They accuse him of trying to embarrass the princess, and he smirks, acknowledging their quick wit. The guests whisper about the prince choosing another woman for the first dance, noting how embarrassing it is for the princess, as Duke Balthazar watches silently. From the side, the Duke observes the scene with a cold, unreadable expression behind his mask. The masked man twirls Antonio gracefully on the dance floor. He leans in, correctly guessing that Duke Balthazar doesn't know Antonio is a woman, leaving them stunned. He offers to help, and Antonio cautiously asks how. Like this, he declares, pulling them in closer. The Duke and his sister watch in utter shock as the man dips Antonio dramatically. Leaning in, he creates the illusion of a kiss, horrifying Antonio. FWIP. He smoothly pulls away, concluding their charade. Smile. The masked blonde man says he won't forget the debt he now owes them. Oh no, Antonio says, thinking the man will come to regret his actions. Debt. The Duke approaches them with a menacing aura as Antonio realizes he's coming for them. Eek. The blonde man cheekily turns to the Duke, asking if he's come for a dance. The Duke orders him to move, but the man smirks, noting his insolence and interest in the lady. Crackle. As a tense energy fills the air between the two men, Antonio decides to sneak away. Dash. The Duke grabs the man's arm as he shouts, "Hey!" giving Antonio the perfect chance to flee while screaming. A desperate cry for help echoes through the gardens. Antonio finally stops in a moonlit garden, panting for breath after their escape. Phew! Hiding in the bushes, they realize with a sigh that they ran away unintentionally. Scratch, scratch! As they fret over what to do, a gloved hand appears ominously before them. Chills. The Duke looms over them, calling them a good runner, before uttering their true name, Rosalia de Hessink. He asks how many times she's run from him now, but a nervous Rosalia claims he is mistaken. Step. He slowly approaches, revealing he investigated her death certificate and discovered it was a forgery. FWIP. The Duke kneels down, trapping the terrified Rosalia against the wall. He states plainly that Antonio has been lying, and Rosalia curses her bad luck. When he asks about Antonio, she quickly defends him, claiming he was only doing it for her sake. The Duke, realizing they both deceived him, offers a new way for her to pay the debt, by working for him too. Ah! A stunned Rosalia shouts, asking if he wants her to act as two different people. He calmly states that it's unfair for Antonio to pay the family's debt alone, leaving her speechless. Apologizing for the deception, Rosalia refuses his offer, deciding she might as well push her luck. She stands and vows to pay the debt herself, offering to visit on Antonio's day off so he knows she won't run. The Duke observes her, thinking that even if they aren't blood related, she and Antonio are truly siblings in spirit. Dash. He has a sudden realization about her resemblance just as Cosette runs into the garden, calling for her brother. Cosette rushes to Rosalia's side, asking if Rosalia's okay. The Duke watches them, musing that he was wondering how his sister had gotten inside. HMPH, Cosette stands defiantly between Rosalia and the Duke. She argues that it's fine as long as the debt is paid, while Rosalia agrees in thought. The Duke scolds his sister's brazenness. Elsewhere in the garden, a white-haired man searches for the Duke, spotting him in the bushes. Done! The Duke points at Rosalia, declaring they'll meet again for the next payment. The white-haired man wonders where the Duke went, as Rosalia and Cosette stand together, lost in thought. Phew! The blonde woman apologizes to Cosette for the trouble, but Cosette reassures her that it's all right. Cosette complains that her brother is so dumb and obtuse, despite being quick-witted in other ways. Feeling her heart race, Claudette suggests the blonde woman should return now, and she agrees. Clack. As they leave, Claudette warns her to be careful of Klaus's sneaking, causing a nearby masked man to panic. The scene shifts to a sunny, rustic tavern decorated with sunflowers. A young man with green hair sits at a table, lost in thought. He recalls the blonde woman promising to visit him instead of Antonio, wondering why she said that. Cough cough. He decides to find a new painting, just as a dark-haired woman approaches his table. Deb. The woman asks him what he would like to have. He notices faint traces of paint on her fingertips. Glance. With a flash of realization, his eyes widen. He identifies her as Nadia Erlos, the acclaimed artist behind the Crown Princess's collection. Smiling, He orders 1 beer, and she asks if he wants a side dish. Grab? He quickly grabs the paper from her hand, telling her to hold on. He asks for her name, but she suspiciously questions his motive. A voice calls for Nadia from upstairs as she scoffs at the idea of being nice. The green-haired man smiles, his suspicions confirmed. He thinks to himself that he definitely came to the right place. Dash. As an angry Nadia turns to leave, the man grabs her arm to stop her. She runs off anyway, leaving him shocked and wondering what just happened. The scene transitions to the magnificent Baltazar estate. The green-haired man walks through the hall, frustrated that his trip was for nothing and confused about why she ran. He wonders what's wrong with him lately, when a voice from behind calls his name, Antonio. Jolt! Startled, Antonio denies the Duke's accusation that he's feeling guilty, insisting he's just paying his debt. The Duke puts a hand on his shoulder, certain Antonio has something to tell him, but Antonio feigns confusion. Sweat. The Duke confronts him about his dead sister being alive at the banquet. Done. The Duke's menacing glare makes Antonio think he's about to be killed for his deception. A terrified Chibi Antonio faces an enraged Chibi Duke. The terrified Antonio is humorously framed as if in a funeral portrait. Antonio looks up nervously, admitting he didn't know what kind of person the Duke was. Sparkle. He now showers the Duke with praise, calling him merciful and kind while asking for understanding. The Duke calls Antonio's name, making him flinch in response. As the Duke hesitates, Antonio wonders why he isn't acting like his usual self. The Duke covers his mouth, appearing to struggle with his words. He unexpectedly thanks Antonio for everything, leaving him completely stunned. Flinch. Antonio asks what he just said and the Duke confirms it, mentioning how Clausette referred to him. Antonio stares blankly, processing the Duke's words. The Duke looks aside, his expression softening with thought. He remembers seeing Clausette happily on Antonio's arm at the ball. He realizes with a somber look that he couldn't even remember anything about his own sister's debut ball, thanking Antonio for the preparations and the reminder. Antonio is left speechless by the Duke's sincere gratitude. The scene moves to a bright, bustling town market. Antonio, disguised as a blonde woman, walks through the market, reflecting that he never knew the Duke could say such things. He recalls the Duke forgiving his lie just once, but warning him it won't be tolerated again. Walking through the crowd, she thinks about how totally unexpected his reaction was. Clench. She clutches the front of her dress, still reeling from the encounter. She finds Nadia and rushes over, trying to explain that she couldn't help what happened yesterday. Nadia turns away, desperately pleading for another chance at her job. A stern man fires Nadia, cruelly telling her he only hired her out of pity and that she doesn't live in a fairy tale. Slam. A door is shut in a woman's face as she's told to get lost. Coughing, the brunette woman glares at a blonde watching her and demands to know what she's looking at. Turn, the blonde woman calls out, trying to stop the brunette from walking away. The brunette demands to know why she is being followed, and the blonde apologizes for intruding. Chills, the brunette coldly tells the blonde to mind her own business and leave her alone. Step, the blonde follows anyway, thinking the woman is scary but glad her disguise is holding up. Bump. While trying to explain that she can't just look away, the blonde accidentally runs into the brunette. The two women stand together in a moment of surprised silence. The blonde woman gasps, a look of sudden shock on her face. FWIP, a hand in the shadows, suddenly draws a sharp dagger. Two men corner the brunette, smugly identifying her as Nadia Erlos and telling her she can't hide. Sneak, the blonde and Nadia hide as the men approach to talk things over. Grabbing Nadia, the blonde demands to know if she borrowed money from them, but Nadia just curses. The blonde tries to give Nadia a signal, but one of the men grabs her. Grab, shove, Nadia pushes the man away from the blonde, insisting she doesn't know her. Clack! The man doesn't believe her and takes Nadia hostage with his knife as she insists they are strangers. He threatens to sell the blonde woman off, causing her to panic and wonder if this event happened in the novel. Task, Nadia angrily turns on the blonde, blaming her for the situation. Resolved to survive, the blonde recalls watching a self-defense video on her phone once. She remembers a video teaching basic self-defense techniques, including a power punch, MMPH. Executing her plan, she suddenly covers a confused Nadia's mouth. IA, following the video's advice to confuse an assailant, she screams loudly as Nadia yells for help. The two men are momentarily stunned by the sudden, loud screaming. Elsewhere, the Duke pauses, telling his aide he thought he heard something just now. His aide claims to have heard nothing and urges the Duke to hurry to his meeting with the Merchant Guild's leader. Freeze. The Duke stops walking, still troubled by the sound he heard. Dash. The men charge forward, ordering the women to shut up. As an attacker rushes her, the blonde recalls the self-defense video's instructions for countering a charge. She prepares her stance, bringing her hands to her chest as the man curses at her. Whack! She pushes him squarely in the face, using his momentum against him. Crash! As the man topples backward, she yells at Nadia for them to run. Dash! Wish! Their escape is cut short as a hand lunges out to grab them. The second attacker catches them, laughing menacingly that they are in trouble now. He calls their move a big mistake, but his threat is cut short by a powerful kick from off-screen. Wham! The Duke appears, sending the man flying through the air with a single, devastating kick. Thud! Ugh! A magical blue flower glows faintly as the attacker groans in pain. Ugh! The man lies unconscious on the ground, completely defeated. The two women stare in shock, and the blonde stammers, "Your Grace." Dash! The Duke addresses the blonde as Roselia, sighing about the surprises she brings as the second thug tries to flee. Pow! Wham! Roselia notes the Duke's fighting skill as he easily takes down the second man, then urges Nadia to go. Huff huff, they hide behind some crates. Nadia asks why they're hiding from their rescuer, but Roselia admits she ran on instinct. After a coughing fit, Nadia confirms she's alright, and then asks if the blonde's name is Roselia. Wish? Nadia extends her hand graciously, stating that even though they are strangers, she now owes Roselia one. Roselia decides this must be fate and invites Nadia to come with her. Step, the two women walk away from the scene together. Nadia leads Roselia to a wooden door, telling her to come inside. Welcoming Roselia inside, Nadia says that while it isn't much, it's her home. Nadia offers to show her gratitude, but Roselia politely declines, saying it's unnecessary. Plop, insisting she must repay the favor, Nadia gently guides Roselia to a chair. Roselia watches Nadia walk away, her expression thoughtful and quiet. Clatter! In a dusty room, Nadia gives Roselia a painting, explaining it's all she has left as Roselia realizes the depth of her poverty. Roselia gasps in utter shock, recognizing the artwork, which she identifies it as a piece from the Crown Princess's collection, marveling at its radiant beauty. Cough. Nadia reveals it is her final painting, and Roselia wonders with dread if she knows her fate. Roselia recalls that the talented artist dies from illness before ever receiving the recognition she deserves. She sadly reflects that this abstract piece was indeed Nadia's last. Cough, cough. As Nadia laments having no money for paint, Roselia worriedly asks if she's seen a doctor. Nadia dismisses the idea, saying she's too poor and has accepted she doesn't have much time left. Roselia asks if she tried selling her art. Nadia states bleakly that for sick people like her, all they can do is wait for death. Gazing at her art supplies, she explains that painting was her only escape from a harsh reality. She proudly declares that she would sell everything she owns before she would ever sell her freedom. As Nadia clears her throat, Roselia quietly thinks her name. Roselia now understands just how much painting truly meant to her. For Nadia, her art was her one and only hope. Bow. Nadia warns Roselia not to return to town, lest she have another run-in with the thugs. Clutching the painting, Roselia promises to be back soon, much to Nadia's annoyance. At the Crown Princess's palace, a visitor from Duke Balthazar is announced. Bow. Inside, Antonio greets the Crown Princess, who acknowledges it has been a while. The princess says she was sorry to have missed him at the ball, having heard he retired early. Gulp. She then mentions meeting his sister, Roselia, causing a nervous Antonio to recall the event. The princess notes the prince's interest in Roselia. Baidum. Antonio's heart races as he thinks that the prince was just using them. As the princess approaches, Antonio's boots tremble nervously. Grin. The princess asks him to arrange a meeting with Roselia, and a jolted Antonio demands to know why. She calmly tells him not to be nervous, as she has no intention of interrogating his sister. The princess reminds him that she will soon be the Empress of Rugvelset. She explains that the prince has reservations about their union and will continue his antics unless he embraces his duty. Antonio acknowledges her insight, thinking that as the female lead, she understands the prince perfectly. The princess declares she cannot permit any threats to the royal family, like those who hold sway over the prince. She then reveals her shocking plan, to propose that Roselia become the prince's mistress. What? He frantically refuses, insisting Roselia is an uneducated commoner and unfit for the role. The princess counters that the royal family can provide her education, as it's not the first time a commoner has become a mistress. Antonio recalls how he once admired the crown princess for her strong sense of duty and responsibility. He asks if she truly believes this is for the best, and she confirms it's not a bad offer. Seeing his hesitation, she asks what is troubling him. He looks her in the eyes, asking if, aside from her duty, this is what she personally wants. The princess dismisses it as a strange question, stating her desires and her duty are one and the same. She continues, unable to even imagine herself as anything other than the crown princess. She declares that whether she is seen as Evelion or the crown princess, there is no difference. Antonio softly says her title as she looks on with a distant, somber expression. Confusing the princess, Antonio states that he is simply known as the Duke's servant. He adds that others think of him as a former noble. A vision appears of Antonio and Roselia standing back to back, united. The crown princess watches him, her expression unreadable. Antonio smiles brightly, holding the painting he's brought. The camera focuses on Antonio's confident stance from the waist down. The crown princess looks down, a flicker of uncertainty in her thoughts. A close-up highlights the ornate brooch on her elegant red dress. The princess now observes Antonio standing beside an easel displaying a new painting. She silently questions her own feelings, wondering what she truly wants. Antonio admits that frequently he is reminded of something personal. The crown princess stands before the radiant painting. Deep in thought, she confesses sadly that paintings have become her only refuge. The princess recalls that she never expected much from Prince Esteban, only his respect for the family's sake. She senses loneliness in the beautiful art as Antonio realizes both the princess and the artist are women who have had everything taken from them. Antonio smiles, saying he's glad she likes the painting. As a vision of a woman in a red dress appears in a field, Antonio begins to reveal the painting's title. He confidently announces that the title of the painting is Freedom. The crown princess quietly reflects on the word, a thoughtful expression on her face. Knock, knock, a sound comes from a nearby door. Cough. As Nadia answers the door, Roselia cheerfully announces her arrival. Clack. Nadia opens her door, annoyed that Roselia ignored her warning to stay away. Nadia stares in shock as Roselia, surrounded by people, reminds her, I told you I'd come back. Roselia has brought help. Workers start fixing the house while a doctor asks a stunned Nadia about her symptoms. Nadia demands to know what is going on as the doctor examines her. Roselia smiles kindly, about to explain the wonderful news. A stunned Nadia learns that the crown princess was deeply impressed by her work. Nadia is left utterly speechless by the revelation. Clack. A wooden case full of new art supplies is open. Roselia presents a beautiful, fully stocked paint set to Nadia. Giving her the gift, Roselia promises Nadia that she'll never have to give up painting again. FWIP. Nadia closes the lid on the precious gift. Clutching the box of paints, Nadia is overcome with emotion and begins to cry. Through tears of gratitude, she manages a simple, heartfelt thank you. Clack, clack. Upstairs, the workers continue their repairs on her home. Nadia quietly asks Roselia if she will visit often. Admitting it gets lonely. Grin, Roselia brightly agrees, promising to come as often as she'd like. Roselia reminds her to keep taking her medicine, and Nadia agrees. Smile, the two friends share a drink as Roselia thinks how much things have already changed for the better. The scene shifts to the sprawling, magnificent estate of Duke Balthazar. Roselia arrives at the estate, stealing her nerves as she thinks, I'm finally here. A brief vision of herself in an elegant blue gown flashes through her mind. Sigh, regretting her promises, Roselia knocks on the Duke's door. Knock, knock. From outside the room, she formally announces herself to Your Grace. The Duke, surprised to see Roselia, invites her to come in. Clack. The Duke taunts her about her simple dress, and Roselia replies she is saving money to repay him, thinking he is a jerk. Chills. The Duke coldly mentions that she ran away again, prompting a nervous Roselia to quickly thank him for his help. Questioning her bizarre behavior, the Duke demands she stop being stubborn and come stay at his estate. Roselia knows there's only one answer she can ever give him. FWIP, she places a letter on his desk, insisting she prefers her life as it is, much to his disbelief. He asks how much she's willing to endure, but she coldly tells him it's none of his concern. Roselia insists she can take care of herself. But clack, he suddenly grabs her arm. Chills. The Duke fumes over her stubbornness until he is suddenly struck by a familiar, alluring scent. He recalls the sweet and intoxicating aroma that seems to emanate from her. Swap. His perception shifts as he wonders what kind of perfume could smell like that. He confirms that the letter is her debt payment, and she thanks him again for his help. Clinch, Roselia firmly states that he has no right to decide where she lives. Dizzy from her scent, the Duke warns her that her words could be misconstrued to sound like he wants her. He leans in, asking if she's refusing him to get more, before suddenly pulling her into an embrace. Slap, Roselia remains silent, her expression a mixture of surprise and resolve. Flustered, the Duke listens as Roselia states that Antonio will deliver all future payments. As Roselia walks away with a heavy heart, the Duke watches her go, his expression conflicted. He reflects on how pathetic he is for being brought to his senses by her, and chides himself for the foolish things he said. Staring down at the letter she left, he looks up at a starry expanse and wonders why this is happening. Whoosh! A memory begins as a young white-haired girl in a yellow dress bursts in, calling for Antonio to play. Glum, she gasps, finding a despondent young boy with green hair sitting alone on a magnificent bed. Worried, she asks what happened, but he dismisses her concern, saying it's nothing. Sparkle. She presents a tray of cookies, hoping to cheer him up. The girl offers him a cookie, eagerly encouraging him to try one. The young Antonio takes the cookie, his gaze remaining distant and troubled. He suddenly crushes the cookie in a fit of rage, thinking about his frustrations as the girl looks on in shock. Spring, she leaps up, demanding to know why he's taking his anger out on the cookies, and he quickly apologizes. She announces they're going out, leaving him to wonder where. Shine, she declares with a radiant smile that they're going on a picnic to the lake. Dash. He protests that he isn't in the mood, but she grabs his arm and insists the fresh air will do him good. The scene fades back to the present, where stacks of paperwork sit on a desk as a voice calls for your grace. Jolt. Lost in thought, the Duke is startled by his aide. Sigh. The aide asks what's troubling him, and the Duke admits he can't stop thinking about a woman, stunning his assistant. Bottom. The aide's heart flutters with excitement as he asks who the lucky lady is. The Duke insists it's not romantic, prompting the aide to conclude that the only other explanation is she took his money. Groan. The Duke grudgingly admits she did, and the aide's excitement vanishes into understanding. Thwomp. Taking a stack of documents, the aide tells the Duke to go for a walk while he handles the work. Now outside, the Duke wanders the grounds, thinking it's impossible he likes her, and blaming her intoxicating scent for his confusion. He notes that the scent makes him feel dizzy as his eyes land on a small boat in the distance. He's surprised to see a vision of his past on the lake, a young girl he recognizes as Claudette and a boy, Antonio. Clink. In the vision, a smiling Claudette enjoys a cup of tea. Young Antonio sits across from her, asking if she is sure she is all right. Whoosh. A sudden gust of wind blows Claudette's bonnet from her head into the water. Lean. Unconcerned, she says she'll just buy a new one, but Antonio leans over the boat to retrieve it, thinking she shouldn't be treated so dismissively. Claudette yells for Antonio to stop, sensing the danger as he reaches for the bonnet. Wobble. The boat tips precariously as he leans too far, and she cries out that it's dangerous. She screams his name in terror as he loses his balance and falls overboard. Splash. Antonio plunges into the deep blue water. Gurgle, gurgle, he sinks, realizing, with horror, that he doesn't know how to swim and is about to die. As his vision fades, he thinks of his hardships and desperately wishes not to die. His hand reaches weakly toward the light of the surface. A strong hand suddenly reaches down through the water to grasp his. Splash. The adult Duke pulls his younger self out of the water, and they collapse, panting on the grassy bank. Shake, shake, the Duke frantically tries to revive the boy, who finally coughs, sputtering out water. Cough. The boy weakly coughs again, and the Duke watches him with a grave expression. The Duke seizes him, angrily demanding to know what he was thinking by jumping into the lake. Tears stream down the boy's face as he thinks that he finally knows what dying feels like. As the Duke furiously scolds him, the boy thinks to himself that it was because he was fated to die. Choke. Clutching his chest, the boy is overcome with the terrifying realization that he was wrong. The Duke watches with concern as the boy understands that this is his reality now, not just words in a book. Sniffle. The Duke gently holds the boy's hand as the child processes his near-death experience. Sniffle, sniffle. The boy sits up, wiping tears from his eyes. Through his tears, he asks the Duke why he has to be so harsh with someone who nearly died. Dash. Claudette runs toward them, shouting Antonio's name in a panic. Wipe. She rushes to Antonio's side, checking if he's okay as he reassures her that he's fine. Claudette furiously scolds Antonio for his reckless act. Rise. The Duke meekly apologizes as Claudette glares. A blushing and confused Antonio wonders at her reaction. The adult Duke wonders why his younger self is staring at him. Turn. As the Duke walks away, Antonio calls out to thank him. The Duke glances back, warning him to be more careful. Antonio and Claudette sit together in a tense silence. Claudette complains about the Duke's heartlessness and checks on Antonio. Drip, drip. The memory fades as the drenched Duke walks through a grand hall. Wish. His aide watches in shock as the Duke walks past without a word. The Duke pauses, lost in a somber, troubled thought. The memory returns to a dejected young Antonio sitting alone. The scene transitions gently with an image of blue flowers. Back in the present, the Duke questions the strange new feeling inside him. The scene shifts to the magnificent palace of the Crown Princess. Antonio reports to the princess that Nadia accepted her help as sponsorship. Grin, the Crown Princess praises Antonio for his good work. Bo, Antonio humbly replies that he is only following her orders. The princess reveals she has another question for him. She announces the imminent arrival of a delegation from the Lefelios Empire. A knight in armor realizes it is time for the second male lead to be introduced. The princess dreamily invites Antonio and Rosalia to attend as guests of honor. Antonio internally fumes at the idea of accompanying Rosalia to a banquet. Feigning a laugh, Antonio politely declines, claiming it would be improper. Here the princess seems to understand, much to Antonio's relief. Gasp! She then suggests inviting Rosalia by herself, worrying Antonio. Looking crestfallen, the princess wonders if she's asking for too much again. Glum, she laments her lonely existence, making Antonio feel guilty. Yay! The princess beams as Antonio caves and agrees to ask Rosalia. Sigh. Antonio walks away, dreading his upcoming banquet attendance. A voice stops him, noting he met with the crown princess again. A handsome, blonde-haired man in a formal uniform stands before him. Antonio greets Crown Prince Esteban, who casually dismisses the formality. Antonio inwardly wishes the prince would simply treat the princess better. As Antonio tries to leave, the crown prince calls out to him. The prince asks if Antonio knows of a bloodline with a unique aroma. Huh? Antonio is completely baffled by the prince's odd question. The prince asks if Antonio is unaware of his own heritage. He reveals he knows Antonio isn't related to Baron Hessink by blood. Antonio sadly admits he knows nothing of his birth parents. As the prince is about to reveal a secret, an aide interrupts him. The aide urgently informs the prince that the delegation is arriving. Zoom. The aide physically drags the protesting prince away. Annoyed, the crown prince reluctantly agrees to go. Wish. The prince worries that Antonio will be in trouble without guidance. The scene shifts to the duke's aide, introducing himself. The aide thinks about how something has been bothering the duke lately. He recalls seeing the duke sighing and mumbling strangely to himself. The duke summons his aide, Alejandro, and tells him to call for Antonio. Antonio announces his arrival outside the duke's office and is told to enter. Clack. Antonio nervously enters the duke's office, wondering if he's about to be criticized again. The duke asks about his sister Rosalia, specifically if she is engaged to a lover. Utterly bewildered, Antonio asks why his grace would want to know. The duke stands confidently amidst a shower of sparkles, admitting that he's interested in her. Antonio smiles in relief, initially misunderstanding the depth of the duke's interest. His relief vanishes as the full implication dawns on him in a moment of pure shock. The duke questions his surprise, asking if there's an issue with a man being interested in a woman. Flushed and flustered, Antonio stands frozen in the middle of the room. The duke presses him for an answer about a lover, prompting a panicked Antonio to object. Gulp. The duke coldly states he only wants to know if she has a lover, while Antonio thinks he knows how this story ends. Antonio quickly apologizes and prepares to correct himself. FWIP. He declares that Rosalia does have a lover and tells the duke to give up. The duke fidgets, questioning how her supposed lover could let her live in such poverty and danger. Flinch. As the duke scoffs at the idea of such a lover, Antonio stammers that he just lives far away. The duke muses he could simply ignore the lover, causing Antonio to cry out that it's improper. Wish? Antonio insists Rosalia is only interested in her lover, before admitting that's just what he's been told. The duke remarks on how strange his reaction is, leaving Antonio to wonder what he means. Sparkle. Brushing his hair back, the duke wonders why anyone would resist him so strongly. Antonio is horrified, concluding the duke has a severe case of narcissism and contemplates running away. Flinch. The duke warns Antonio about his tone, as the boy asks what other reason there could be for his behavior. Stare. The duke gives him a long, intense look. He waves dismissively, accepting her devotion to a lover, and abruptly telling Antonio to get out. Chills. As Antonio flees, thinking the duke is a tyrant, his grace covers his eyes in frustration. The duke stands alone by the window, silently contemplating what just happened. He questions what he wanted to hear from Antonio and tells himself to get it together. He finally admits to himself that he's attracted to Rosalia, not Antonio, and can't deny it. The scene shifts to a grand castle as a voice welcomes weary travelers. A man with green hair thanks the Royal Highness for their hospitality. He introduces himself as Johannes von Eucliote, Marquess from the Lefelios Empire. A blonde man and a woman in a blue dress react with visible surprise. Johannes asks the Royal Highness if everything is all right. The Crown Prince asks if Johannes has a younger brother, but the Marquess says he does not. The prince accepts his answer, thinking to himself that Evelyn Awa seems to have noticed the resemblance as well. The prince's thoughts reveal that Johannes looks remarkably similar to Antonio, or rather Roselia. Johannes clarifies that while he has no brother, he did have a younger sister. The woman, Evelyn, asks what he means by had. He explains that his sister went missing years ago, and her fate is unknown, prompting a shocked Evelyn to apologize. Johannes reassures her it's in the past, as she wishes him luck in finding his sister. The Crown Prince suggests they proceed, and offers to show him to his accommodations. As they walk, Johannes thinks back on his younger sister. Step, he follows the royal couple, realizing he hasn't thought about her in a long time. The Marquis walks with a somber expression, lost in memory. A memory surfaces of a woman with long green hair, embracing a small, happy girl. He recalls that the last time he saw them, his sister Cecilia was only 3. As he follows the royals up the stairs, he wonders if Cecilia is still alive. The scene transitions to the evening banquet for the Lefilios delegation. Glitter, sparkle, a wide-eyed Roselia, dressed in a beautiful gown, exclaims in delight at the sight. Clack, clack. Carriages arrive at the lavish party as Roselia expresses her feeling of inadequacy, but Nadia quickly reassures her. Nadia reminds Roselia that she is an honored guest of the Crown Princess and should be confident. Taking Nadia's hand, a smiling Rosalia eagerly heads into the banquet. Roselia and Nadia hold hands as they enter the sparkling, magnificent banquet hall. Antonio approaches Nadia, introducing himself to Lady Clausette and requesting the first dance. Rosalia laughs, thinking to herself how popular Clausette is as she's led away to dance. Glancing, Rosalia scans the room, eager to see the second male lead from the Lefilios delegation. Murmur. As ladies gossip, the Duke walks past, prompting Roselia to wonder if that's him. Roselia spots the blonde-haired Crown Prince, uncertain if he's the one from the novel, until he calls her a professional runaway. Bow. Roselia offers a curtsy, sarcastically greeting the son of the Empire, as he questions her hostile reaction. Wave. The prince gestures with his hands, again asking why she's being so abrasive toward him. Smirking, the prince claims he merely wanted to offer her some advice. Roselia stammers an apology, claiming he looked busy, and asks him to just forget it. FWIP. The prince offers to forgive her in exchange for a dance, taking her by surprise. Ugh. Roselia looks thoroughly disgusted by his unwanted advance. Elsewhere, the Duke hands his cape to his aide, Alejandro, who asks if he's heading to the banquet. The Duke confirms his attendance, stating he needs to make a positive impression on the delegation. Bow. Alejandro respectfully sees the Duke off as he heads toward the Grand Hall. Walking past armored guards, the Duke resolves to focus on work and use the banquet to distract himself from thoughts of Roselia. Upon entering the ballroom, he immediately spots Roselia with the Crown Prince and utters her name in disbelief. As he watches her, he wonders why she is here, surrounded by sparkles and golden light. A powerful heartbeat thumps in his chest. Badum! Blushing, the Duke admits to himself that forgetting Roselia is impossible, and considers himself fortunate. His expression hardens with resolve as he thinks, however. The Crown Prince stands before a clearly annoyed Roselia, holding her hand. The prince says he has something to discuss, but Roselia nervously questions if they need to dance to do so. The Duke's voice interrupts, stating it's too crowded, as his footsteps between them. The Duke stands between Roselia and the Crown Prince, causing a stir as guests begin to whisper. The crowd whispers in shock, realizing the Crown Prince and Duke Balthazar are both asking for a dance. Murmur. As onlookers question who Roselia is, the prince accuses the Duke of disrespect, but the Duke says he'll honor Roselia's choice. Sheesh! The two men trade barbs, while a frustrated Roselia thinks about how she dislikes both of them. The Duke and the Crown Prince stand before her, demanding she make a choice. Faced with two outstretched hands, Roselia thinks that she must choose one of them. Her hand moves past the prince's, choosing to take the Duke's gloved hand instead. Surrounded by a shower of sparkles, Roselia accepts the Duke's hand for a dance. The Duke gives a small, satisfied smile as he holds Roselia in a dancing pose. As they dance, Roselia clarifies she didn't want to choose him, and the Duke notes her intense dislike for the prince. The Duke questions her statement, but she simply reminds him that he was the one who asked her to dance. She explains that another dance with the Crown Prince would cause problems for the princess, which seems to surprise the Duke. Scoff. The Duke scoffs softly at her reasoning and asks if he's wrong. Pull. He pulls her closer, leading her into a graceful spin across the ballroom floor. Batum. Blushing, Roselia feels her heart flutter, wondering if the Duke's earlier confession of interest was true. Bottom. Her heart continues to pound as she dances, though she doesn't understand why. Leaning close, the Duke tells her she has certainly captured the Crown Prince's attention and tells her to look. Chills. Ah! Roselia glances over her shoulder and freezes in terror at the sight of the Crown Prince glaring at them. Fidget! The Duke warns her the prince will try to snatch her away after the song, causing Roselia to panic while the Duke smiles subtly. The Duke suddenly takes a firm hold of her hand, confusing her. "Come with me," he says, leading a surprised Roselia off the dance floor. Whoosh! He pulls her out onto a quiet, starlit balcony, leaving her to wonder where they are. The Duke explains they can hide there for a while until things calm down inside. With a serious expression, the Duke asks her how she knows the Crown Prince. Roselia insists she doesn't really know him, as the Duke warns her that the prince's interest will only lead to trouble. Annoyed, Roselia snaps back that he's acting as if she wanted this attention, exclaiming that she's the one suffering. Shoo! Roselia's wide green eyes look up at him, startled by his sudden closeness. Step. The Crown Prince walks alone down the long, sunlit palace corridor. From the balcony, the Duke watches him go, his expression unreadable. As the prince remains silent, the Duke's gaze remains fixed on the prince's retreating figure, a look of contemplation on his face. Bottom. Holding Roselia, the Duke feels his heart pound in time with hers. Bottom. He leans over her as she sits on the balcony floor, the air thick with tension. Blushing, Roselia tells the Duke he's too close and that they should move apart. Caress. He gently strokes her cheek, whispering about how nice she smells, leaving her speechless. Smooched to Roselia's complete shock, the Duke leans in and kisses her cheek. The two are bathed in a sparkling light as he holds her in a tender embrace on the balcony. Badum. As he kisses her, their hearts continue to race in the starlight. Badum! Lost in the moment, Roselia thinks to herself that her lips feel intensely hot. Flinch. Overcome with embarrassment, Roselia breaks away from the kiss. Shove! In a moment of panic, Roselia pushes the Duke away with all her might. Huff! She covers her mouth, horrified as she realizes what she's just done. Dash! Roselia flees the scene, leaving a stunned Duke sitting on the balcony floor. The Duke sits alone in the moonlight, his head bowed in a moment of quiet dejection. Clack! Running through the halls, Roselia panics, wondering what she should do now. Clack. She flees in a frenzy, convinced she's being ridiculous and must have been possessed. Grab. A hand suddenly seizes her arm, stopping her escape. The Crown Prince has caught her, insisting he has something to say, but she begs him to wait. He claims the entire palace is filled with her scent, leaving Roselia utterly bewildered. Sigh. The prince complains that her scent is giving him a headache and scolds her for not being more careful. Sniff. Confused, Roselia sniffs her own dress, wondering what he's talking about as he prepares to say one more thing. The Crown Prince warns her to stay away from the Duke, revealing that he's taken a liking to her. He coldly states he doesn't want to dispose of her, making Roselia wonder if Klaus's tragic fate is about to begin. The narrator reveals the original story, a romance where the prince and princess overcome the villain, the Duke. Roselia resolves not to get involved with Klaus, just as the prince calls down to her from an upper balcony. Tap. Elsewhere, a stern-looking noble with an eye patch watches silently from another balcony, sipping his wine. Clack. As Roselia rushes through a chamber, a surprised Nadia spots her. A disheveled Roselia is confronted by Nadia, who demands to know where she's been. Nadia angrily accuses Roselia of abandoning her at the banquet. Smooch? A vivid memory of the Duke's kiss flashes through Roselia's mind. Shake. Roselia frantically denies doing anything suspicious, but Nadia looks unconvinced. Roselia nervously wonders how Clausette would react if she knew what happened with her brother. PFFT. She imagines an enraged Clausette, accusing her of targeting her brother, and admits she would deserve it. Trying to change the subject, Roselia asks Clausette if she smells anything unusual on her. After confirming she doesn't smell, Roselia claims to feel unwell and asks to leave the party early. Concerned, Clausette immediately offers to call a carriage for her. Clack. A carriage drawn by 2 white horses arrives at the palace entrance. An attendant informs Roselia her carriage is arriving, and she thanks him. Outside, Roselia resolves to escape before seeing Klaus again, feeling unable to face him. Her heart sinks as the Duke suddenly turns around at the top of the stairs. She freezes, certain that Klaus is looking for her as he stands silently watching. Just then, an attendant announces Marquess Ushaliotti's carriage, prompting Roselia to dash past Johannes. Dash. Grab. As she runs by, Johannes unexpectedly grabs her arm, stopping her in her tracks. The Marquis's green eyes widen in shock as he looks at her. Johannes holds the bewildered Roselia, warning her to be careful before asking if he could trouble her for a ride. He offers a charming smile and gestures toward the exit, extending a courteous invitation. The Duke looks up, an exclamation of surprise on his face. He watches in disbelief as Roselia gets into a carriage with Marquess Euclid. As the Marquess helps Roselia into the carriage, the Duke wonders why they are together. An unknown young man with green eyes realizes Roselia must have a lover. Clunk. As the carriage door shuts, the thought concludes that the Marquess must be her lover. The ornate carriage departs from the palace under the starry night sky. Phew. Looking out the window, Roselia breathes a sigh of relief. She formally thanks the Marquess for his help, and he tells her it's quite all right. The Marquess says it's improper to refuse a lady in distress, as Roselia tells him he can drop her off here. He insists on escorting her to her destination, concerned for her safety at such a late hour. Grown, Roselia realizes she can't return to the Duke's estate and must stay with Nadia instead. The Marquis smiles slyly, wondering to himself if it's just him. He asks if they resemble each other, leaving Roselia confused by the question. Clack, clack. As the carriage continues, Roselia begins to ponder his words. Realizing they do look alike, Roselia listens as the Marquis claims she looks like him, being the elder of the two. Haha. Roselia nervously laughs it off as the Marquess formally introduces himself as Johannes von Euclid. Oh, Roselia is stunned, realizing with a blush that he's the handsome second male lead from the story. Johannes explains he is a Marquess, representing the Lophelios delegation, and Roselia introduces herself. Clack. Pointing outside, she tells him it's an honor, but he can drop her off now since she lives nearby. Roselia thanks him profusely as he politely responds from the carriage. With a charming smile, Johannes says he hopes to see Lady Roselia again. A flustered Roselia stammers her agreement as the carriage prepares to leave. Wish, wish. As she walks away, a gloved hand rests on the carriage's window ledge. Seated inside the carriage, Johannes listens as his aide responds. Yes, my lord. He reflects on Roselia de Hessink, noting that, despite her different hair color, she looks just like someone he knows. Back at the Duke Balthazar's estate, the Duke's sister yawns and asks him where Antonio is. Turn! She panics at his question, quickly claiming Antonio is probably resting in his room. The Duke questions her yelling, and she defensively tells him not to bother Antonio since he's feeling ill. The Duke remains silent, his expression stern and unconvinced. Knock, knock. A gloved hand raps on an ornate door. The Duke sighs that Antonio is a handful and announces his presence. He is met with only silence from the other side of the door. Clack. Calling Antonio's name, the Duke declares he's coming in and pushes the door open. He steps into the dark, empty room, realizing something is amiss. Ha! With a smirk, the Duke correctly deduces that Antonio is spending the night out. At a modest home inside a walled town, a voice asks Roselia to be honest. Nadia bluntly asks if Roselia got kicked out, which Roselia quickly denies while serving food. Leaning on her chair, Nadia asks why else she'd show up so late, unless a man was involved. Blush. A shocked Roselia nearly drops the plate, vehemently denying the accusation. Fume. As Roselia fumes, Nadia simply smiles, continuing her drawing. Cough, cough. Nadia suddenly coughs violently, prompting a worried Roselia to ask about her medicine. But Nadia insists she's taking it. Roselia looks on with concern as Nadia explains it will take time for her to get better. Nadia playfully tells Roselia to worry about her own romantic troubles, earning a sharp rebuke. Haha. Laughter carries over a bright sunny view of the Duke's magnificent estate. Antonio returns, thinking it was just an accident, as a voice announces he's finally back. Antonio is shocked to find the Duke sitting in his room, who coldly asks where he has been. Stunned, Antonio demands to know what the Duke is doing in his room, but the Duke insists he answer first. Antonio defiantly asks why it matters to the Duke. He walks away, dismissing the Duke by saying it's his own private business. Glare. The Duke watches him go, his expression hardening as he wonders if Antonio is seeing someone. Antonio asks the Duke to leave his room so he can get changed. The Duke thinks to himself that he smells a faint woman's perfume on Antonio. Chills. The Duke wonders if Antonio really went to see a woman, recalling his private life comment. The Duke reminds Antonio that he works for him and is therefore under his care. The Duke demands to know what private affair was so important, but Antonio insists it's none of his business. The Duke asserts his right to question a commoner, leaving a frustrated Antonio to wonder why he won't let it go. Staring. Deciding to just get it over with, Antonio turns and says he met with a friend. The Duke presses him, asking who it was, but Antonio deflects, questioning his persistence. The Duke asks if the friend was a man or woman, immediately regretting the question as Antonio glares, mentally scolding himself for caring. The Duke listens as Antonio offers to tell him what he wants to know. Da-dun. Antonio declares that he met with a woman, stunning the Duke as a dark aura surrounds him. Antonio asks the Duke to leave, but the Duke just mutters to himself that it was a woman after all. Chills. The Duke coldly accuses Antonio of letting a woman interfere with his work. Antonio counters that it's only 7 in the morning and he isn't on duty yet. Shout. The Duke explodes, shouting that Antonio's behavior, clothes, and even his perfume get on his nerves. Tiesk. As the Duke walks away, a bewildered Antonio wonders what's wrong with him today. Step. Step. The Duke abruptly turns back, startling Antonio, who asks why he isn't leaving. The Duke demands a meeting with Roselia, prompting a flustered Antonio to ask what he wants with her. Dismissing it as a private matter, the Duke smirks, leaving Antonio to think about how petty he is. The Duke then asks where Roselia is staying, and Antonio realizes he wants to talk about the previous night. Flashing back to the kiss, Antonio tells the Duke that Roselia is not available. Blushing, Antonio decides he must protect Roselia, and lies that she's with someone significant. Dash. As the Duke questions this, Antonio flees the room, shouting that it's a family matter. Clunk. Left alone in the room, the Duke stands in stunned silence. He grimaces, wondering if Roselia's relationship with the Marquis is more serious than he thought, and the misunderstanding grows. Now outside, Antonio waters flowers while complaining about how dense the Duke is. Peek. A small blonde girl watches as Antonio calls the Duke a cold-blooded tyrant. Splash. Done. The little girl exclaims that the flower box is flooding, snapping Antonio out of his thoughts. She politely tells Antonio that he doesn't have to help them with the flowers. A kind-faced man with light brown hair approaches, calling out to Mr. Hunter. Haha. The man asks Antonio if something is troubling him, but he quickly denies it. He quietly admits that there's a certain person he can't stop thinking about. Antonio explains he is forced to see this person for work and wants to avoid making things uncomfortable. His thoughts flash back to the image of the Duke passionately kissing Roselia. Ruffle, ruffle. He grabs his hair, blushing as he exclaims that he must have been out of his mind. Jolt. The man observes that it doesn't sound like he hates them, causing Antonio to frantically insist he hates them more than anyone. The man wisely suggests that Antonio needs to confront the person he's thinking about. He continues, stating that avoiding them won't solve anything. He advises Antonio that he must make a decision if he wants to be free from his intrusive thoughts. The man cheers him on to face his troubles like a man, and Antonio agrees, apologizing internally for his deception. After thanking the man for his advice, Antonio resolves to confront the Duke and waves goodbye. Step. As Antonio walks through a town square, he sees a man shove an elderly nobleman to the ground. Shove. The aggressor walks off as the elderly man cries out that he has plenty of money. Dadun. He pats his pocket, but realizes with shock that his money is gone. The thief smirks as he leaves, and Antonio rushes to help the fallen man. The elderly man snaps at him, angrily asking if he looks all right, startling Antonio. The old man furiously accuses Antonio of stealing his money, but Antonio calmly denies it. When Antonio offers to escort him home, the man recoils, convinced he's trying to steal even more. TSK. After dismissing Antonio, the elderly man walks away as Antonio decides it's none of his business. Antonio watches him go, thinking what a grumpy old man he is. After a moment of hesitation, Antonio silently follows the man down the street. He suddenly reaches out and grabs the elderly man's arm. A strange glow emanates from the man's arm as Antonio points forward, stopping him. The elderly man looks back, thinking to himself that something about the boy was off. Antonio insists on knowing his address as the man protests, finally mumbling that he lives on Bronx Street. Squeeze. Holding the man's hand, Antonio leads him away, questioning why he keeps getting involved. Ahem. They arrive at a magnificent mansion, and Antonio asks if he's certain this is the correct address. As the old man walks toward the entrance, Antonio yells that he can't just go in there. Antonio is shocked to read the nameplate, Count Vernus's estate. The man turns back, inviting him in, leaving Antonio to wonder if it's a trap. Dash. Antonio hurries after him, asking if he owns the mansion, to which the man matter-of-factly says of course. A bead of sweat rolls down Antonio's face as he realizes it really is him. Stunned, Antonio sees a nameplate identifying the man as the renowned artist, Count Baldro de Vernus. Antonio feels incredibly lucky to have met a famous artist, but notices the mansion is covered in cobwebs. The Count explains that everyone left, prompting a confused Antonio to ask why. The Count admits he forgot to pay their salaries, and Antonio is left speechless. Oh. Antonio recalls from the novel that the Count despite his failing memory, still created masterpieces that could clear his debt. When he asks about paintings, the Count says he doesn't have any. Looking utterly perplexed, the Count wonders aloud if he even knows how to paint. Gasp. Antonio is horrified by the extent of the Count's memory loss. The Count suddenly demands to know who Antonio is, leaving Antonio to realize he has his work cut out for him. At the Rugvelzet Palace, an aide named Ragnan reports to Marcus Euceliode that he has investigated Rosalia as requested. Russell. The aide hands Johannes a report detailing how Rosalia de Hessink is paying off her late father's debt. Johannes is surprised to read that she has a brother. Ragnan explains they aren't blood-related, as she was adopted 19 years ago after her mother married the Baron. Johannes stands in stunned silence, processing the new information. Granin rushes to his side as Johannes clutches his head, overcome with a sudden pain. A flood of traumatic memories returns of his mother and a girl named Cecilia going missing. A younger Johannes reaches out desperately into a blinding light, leaning on the table for support. Johannes realizes the timeline of Rosalia's adoption matches his past trauma. Looking intensely at his aide, Johannes asks about Lady Rosalia's mother. Ragnan replies that she passed away 19 years ago, causing Johannes to despair that he's too late, though he wonders if his mother could still be alive. Wave. Johannes quietly dismisses his aide for the time being. FWIP. Looking at the report, Johannes wonders if his mother was trying to hide her and Cecilia's identities from someone who was chasing them. Clench. He clutches the papers, admitting this could all be desperate speculation. With grim determination, he resolves that he must know if Rosalia de Hessink is actually Cecilia. Sparkle. Back at the Count's estate, the building now gleams in the sunlight. Gleam. The interior is now spotless, with polished candelabras and fresh flowers. Antonio wipes his brow, pleased with his cleaning efforts as the Count watches from the background. Grin. He cheerfully offers the Count food, calling him Grandpa, much to the Count's annoyance. Antonio playfully feeds the Count, insisting that a healthy body leads to a healthy mind. As Antonio encourages him to get better so he can paint, the Count feels an ominous shiver. Antonio calls out a cheerful goodbye, but the Count yells back that he wasn't invited to return. Clack, clack. Carrying his luggage, Antonio directs a carriage to take him to Duke Baltazar's estate. Clunk, clunk. Inside the carriage, he sets down his luggage and fresh clothes. FWIP. He runs a hand through his hair, preparing himself for his return. The carriage arrives at the Duke's grand estate, and Antonio instructs the driver to take his luggage inside. Sparkle. As he steps out, his appearance has completely changed into a beautiful blonde woman in a floral dress, startling the driver. Now revealed to be Rosalia, she looks at the estate with determination, thinking it's time to end this. In a grand hall, the dark-haired Duke sits pensively on his ornate chair. Sigh, he lets out a weary breath. He recalls a memory of kissing a blonde woman in a purple gown. Jolt! An attendant announces Lady Rosalia, startling the Duke. Rustle, rustle. He quickly composes himself. Determined to stay calm, he picks up his quill, coldly granting her permission to come in. A blonde woman in a floral dress peeks in, stealing her own nerves. Wish! She makes a grand entrance, asking why he was looking for her before stammering nervously. The Duke asks where she has been, but she flatly refuses to tell him. Internally fuming, the Duke demands to know if she was with the man she calls her lover. The blonde woman states she is only there to clarify their relationship. She declares she has no feelings for him and asks him to stop making things awkward for her and Antonio, earning a scoff from the Duke. Drag. The Duke rises from his chair, questioning if she truly has no feelings at all. He closes the distance between them, asking about their passionate moment the other night, which she dismisses. She insists what happened between them was a mistake, as she's already in love with someone else. He leans in close to her face, questioning if it was truly a mistake. Smooch. He pulls her into a deep, passionate kiss. She looks up at him, flustered and blushing after he breaks the kiss. He questions how it can be a mistake when she's kissing him back while claiming to love another. She closes her eyes, unable to deny her body's reaction. He concedes a physical attraction, while she internally blames Rosalia's body for its natural pull toward Klaus, insisting it's nothing more. She declares she won't bet her future on a hopeless relationship, reminding him they are merely creditor and debtor. He holds her hand, asking if she would save him if he were framed as a traitor. She coldly accuses him of being the type to abandon anyone, including a lover, to avoid risk. A faint image of another woman appears as she finishes her thought, saying he'd abandon even a lover. She calls his speculation unfair, but he notes that her failure to deny it confirms his point. Clack. She turns to leave, telling him not to play with her feelings when he isn't serious. Clack. Walking away, she celebrates, believing she has successfully avoided Roselia's tragic fate from the novel. As her hair color shifts to mint green, she thinks that simply surviving is enough for her. Her hair returns to blonde, as she finds herself crying, confused by her own tears. Sniffle. Realizing this body has a mind of its own, she walks away from the estate. An arriving carriage is identified as being at Duke Balthazar's estate. A green-haired man arrives with his attendant, dismissing concerns about not having an appointment. He clarifies that he is not there to see the Duke, but his servant, Antonio. He recalls his plan. Unable to find Roselia, he decided to seek out her stepbrother, Antonio. He remembers Antonio works at the Duke's estate, just as the woman he seeks stands at the gates. The blonde woman is startled as a voice calls out Roselia. Grab? The Duke suddenly appears and grabs her arm, shocking her. From a distance, the green-haired man watches the confrontation with a grim expression. She struggles against the Duke's grip, demanding he let her go, but he refuses to let her leave. FWIP. As she insists she has nothing to say, a new voice asks if there is a problem. The green-haired man, Marquess Eucaliode, steps in, much to the Duke's surprise. Snatch! The Marquess forcefully pulls the woman's arm from the Duke's grasp. He positions himself protectively in front of her, telling Duke Balthazar that he is hurting the lady. After the Marquess checks if she is all right, the Duke glares at the hand holding hers. The Duke glances down at his ornate brooch, a thoughtful expression on his face. The Marquess suggests they go somewhere else, while the Duke watches them silently. Waft. As they walk away, the Marquess catches a familiar scent from the woman. He looks at her, now certain that she is his kin. A narration explains that nobles of Lophelios have unique pheromonal aromas, often undetectable by the same sex. TSS's. Roselia feels a strange sensation, recalling that her unique scent intensifies with strong emotions. Johannes thinks of Cecilia and dismisses his thoughts, inviting Rosalia to go somewhere else with him. As Johannes and Roselia walk together, the Duke watches them with a stern expression from a distance. Clunk. Johannes thinks about the hardships Roselia must have faced alone in a foreign land. Gazing at her reflection, he firmly believes that she is his long-lost sister, Cecilia. Rosalia thanks Johannes for his help, wondering inwardly why he is staring at her so intensely. Johannes decides it's not the right time for such a shocking revelation, and instead asks her about the trouble she had with the Duke. Haha. Roselia nervously dismisses it as a business disagreement, while Johannes concludes the rumors about her debt to the Duke are true. Claiming she has business to attend to, Roselia asks to be let out of the carriage, and Johannes agrees. Roselia notices he seems disappointed, and he almost calls her Cece before correcting himself and asking to see Miss Roselia again. Startled by his request, Roselia asks why, prompting a flustered Johannes to insist she's misunderstood. With a kind smile, Johannes offers his help whenever she might need it. Clack. Roselia hesitantly agrees, thinking his behavior is strange as she walks through the town square. Clack. Watching him wave goodbye from his carriage, Roselia admits to herself that she doesn't find him repulsive. She wonders if it's just because he's handsome, and resolves to change her clothes and return to the estate. Ta-da! Back at the Count's mansion, Antonio proudly shows off a model ship. Antonio asks the Count if the ship inspires him to paint, thinking about his ongoing efforts to restore the man's memories. Scratch. The Count ignores the prompt, complaining about an itchy mosquito bite, and Antonio realizes this won't be easy. Antonio holds the ship, determined to get the Count to paint again so he can finally pay off his debt. He pulls out a portrait, asking if it's the Count's son. The Count confirms it, adding that he leads the Empire's mightiest naval fleet. The Count calls his son an ingrate for never visiting, while Antonio notes that the son must have followed his father's naval career. Gleam. Antonio's eyes light up as he asks about the Count's military days, and the old man clears his throat to begin. Ahem. The Count vividly recalls commanding warships and fighting a kraken. Crack. Antonio is thrilled, realizing the memories are returning. The Count proudly recounts his fleet's invincible reputation and his victory at the Schliemann battle. Whoa! His expression darkens as he remembers losing many comrades, sorrowfully murmuring the name Bagnan. The Count is suddenly lost in a traumatic flashback, shouting for Bajan and ordering a retreat. Zip. Back in the present, the Count calms himself with a cup of tea as Antonio watches quietly. Antonio reflects on how frightening that episode was. Aim. He recalls the Count acting as if he were still at sea, forcing Antonio to physically restrain and calm him down. Antonio supports the distressed Count, realizing the old man is still haunted by trauma from his past. The two sit in silence for a moment after the intense flashback. Hearing a knock, the Count asks who's there, and Antonio gets up to answer the door. Ding dong! Antonio dashes toward the grand entrance. Dash! Ding dong! He reaches the door, wondering who could possibly be visiting. A cheerful young woman with long white hair appears at the door, waving hello. Antonio asks how she found them. She explains she investigated after he stopped spending time with her and asks to greet the Count. The white-haired woman extends her hand with a welcoming gesture. The Count glares at her and shouts that he's not buying whatever she's selling. Antonio tries to explain she isn't a salesperson and introduces her as Lady Balthazar. What? Lady Balthazar is shocked when the Count repeats his refusal. She whispers to Antonio, questioning if this grumpy old man is really the artist she seeks. She reminds Antonio that he needs the Count's help to get out of Klaus's jurisdiction, while the Count stares blankly at a canvas. Haha, Lady Balthazar confidently declares that it's her time to shine, leaving Antonio looking puzzled. Brush. She takes up a palette and brush, beginning to paint on the canvas. She cheerfully asks for the Count's opinion, startling him. She proudly presents her masterpiece, a very childish drawing of a house and garden. As the Count stares blankly, she challenges him to prove he can do better. Antonio watches from the side with a plate of food, thinking this wasn't the kind of help he expected. Hup, she places a fresh canvas on the easel, and Antonio asks what she's doing. Lady Balthazar smiles brightly, remarking that painting is more fun than she thought. Antonio offers a snack, finding the white-haired lady cute as she ponders her painting. Haha! The Count snatches the snacks, leaving a dismayed Antonio to protest. A single snack remains on the table. Lady Balthazar studies her blank canvas, deep in thought as the Count watches. The Count observes her work, feeling that something looks off. Comparing her childish painting to the real flowers, he knows something isn't right. Snatch! The Count suddenly grabs the brush from a startled Lady Balthazar. FWIP. He begins to critique her technique, pointing out flaws as Antonio looks on. The Count now stands before the easel, his focus entirely on the vase of blue roses. He clears his throat, and Antonio and Lady Balthazar gasp in awe. Whoa! The Count's beautifully rendered painting is revealed, and Antonio proudly tells her he was right. FWIP. Lady Balthazar enthusiastically praises the Count's skill, and he seems genuinely surprised by the compliment. He stares at his own hand, as if rediscovering a long-lost part of himself. The Count abruptly demands food, prompting Lady Balthazar to angrily defend Antonio. Antonio watches them, a new thought occurring to him. Gasp! The Count points at Antonio, asking why a girl is wearing men's clothes, shocking everyone. Antonio nervously asks what he said, but the Count just repeats that he's hungry. The two youths exchange a worried glance as the Count wonders what he could have said. The scene shifts to the Grand Balthazar estate at sunset. Clack, clack. Walking down the hall, Lady Balthazar admits the Count's words startled her, and Antonio agrees he was nervous. Chills. Antonio thinks he was almost found out, just as a dark voice asks, found out what? Aye. Duke Balthazar appears suddenly, causing Antonio and Lady Balthazar to cry out in shock. Lady Balthazar scolds the Duke for sneaking up, but he ignores her, pressing Antonio for an answer before she tries to lead him away. They stop in their tracks as the Duke begins to question Antonio. The Duke asks if he's heard from Roselia. Antonio nervously denies it and is quickly dismissed. Antonio hurries away, leaving the Duke to watch him go. The Duke stands alone in the hall, his expression thoughtful and grim. He turns and walks down the long, sunlit corridor. The scene changes to the palace conference hall for the Lafilios delegation. Chatter. Johannes Usiliote walks past a group of men conversing in the hall. A nobleman greets Duke Balthazar with a bow. Johannes approaches the Duke, inquiring about the reason for his visit. Johannes remarks on Duke Balthazar and Roselia's supposed closeness, and the Duke feigns ignorance. Peeved Johannes's claim of their long relationship makes the Duke choke, blurting out Cecilia's name before catching himself. The Duke claims he and she have been reunited, expressing his joy, while Johannes privately thinks she must have her reasons. Johannes looks concerned, thinking that Cecilia has a lot to deal with. Heh. Back at the estate, Lady Balthazar proudly shows off a beautiful forest painting, impressing Antonio. Wink. She credits the Count's advice for her newfound talent. Clack. Antonio turns his head, hearing a sound behind him. The Duke stands beside a covered object on a table, puzzling the other two. He simply states that he bought the gift for her. Surprised by the personal gesture, Lady Balthazar lifts the cloth. Chirp! A lovely yellow canary is revealed, and she exclaims how cute it is. Jolt. She looks up, visibly startled by the thoughtful gift. She offers a shy, hesitant thanks to the Duke. Antonia watches the exchange with a sudden, serious look. She smiles, wondering what to name the bird, and marveling at the Duke's rare smile. Jolt! The Duke suddenly calls out to Antonio, making him jump. He invites a very confused Antonio to have tea with him. Steam, steam. A steaming cup of tea sits on a saucer. The Duke invites a nervous Antonio to have tea by the fire. Sip. Antonio cautiously sips his tea, wondering about the Duke's sudden change in behavior and fearing poison. The Duke praises Antonio's impressive progress in paying off his debt, while Antonio ponders his change of heart. With a gentle smile, the Duke admits he never expected Antonio to repay even half the debt. Antonio gets flustered by the Duke's smile, worrying that he's starting to like him. Looking up with a serious expression, Antonio asks what he means. The Duke offers his continued support, saying Antonio will need a steady income to live with Roselia. Rattle! Antonio refuses the offer of a nearby house, declaring he'll leave once his debt is paid, prompting the Duke to ask where he'll go. Antonio admits he hasn't decided his future, only that he wants to leave, but is startled when the Duke asks if he plans to follow Roselia to Lefelios. The Duke mentions Roselia's relationship with Marquess Eucaliote, leaving Antonio stunned by the news. Haha, Antonio quickly and nervously agrees that the two are indeed in a relationship. In his flustered state, Antonio accidentally knocks over his teacup. Clatter. Antonio apologizes and kneels to clean the spill, wondering why the Duke thinks he is in a relationship with the Marquess. Chills. He rationalizes that lying is acceptable since he can explain the situation to the Marquess later, given the man's apparent fondness for him. The Duke comments that Antonio and Roselia smell strangely similar. When asked if they share perfume, Antonio quickly explains they probably just use the same soap. The Duke departs, urging Antonio to consider his offer, calling it a good deal. Antonio quietly agrees to think about the Duke's offer. Clack. Leaving the room, Antonio sighs in relief, baffled by the Duke's sudden, gentle behavior. Blushing, he tells himself not to let his guard down, remembering the Duke is still a cold-hearted man. Trudge. Trudge. He walks down the hall, deciding it's best to avoid dressing as a lady for a while. At the Crown Princess's palace, a blonde princess expresses shock upon hearing Antonio fell into a lake. Clausette exclaims that someone would jump into a lake for a hat, but Roselia clarifies that he fell in. The blonde princess wonders why she's present, but is glad Antonio is safe, having heard the Duke rescued him. The princess remarks that the Duke can be caring and asks Clausette about a time he caught a rabbit for her. A flashback shows a young Klaus holding a live rabbit 8 years ago. The princess recalls how he threatened to skin it to make her earmuffs. Young Klaus presents the rabbit to a younger, shocked version of the princess and Clausette, PFFT. The princess laughs, remembering that a tearful young Clausette ended up hugging the rabbit instead. Clausette expresses her shock at the memory, while the blonde princess admits she's surprised to hear such stories about the Duke. The princess thanks Roselia for the invitation, and Roselia replies that she always has time for good company. Cough. Roselia begins to speak about families from Lefelios, but starts coughing as the princess asks if they have a unique aroma. Clausette asks if Roselia is all right, while the princess inwardly thinks Roselia was about to discuss the second male lead. The princess explains that while a family with a unique aroma exists, their bloodline is now too diluted to easily identify them. Roselia and Clausette listen with shocked expressions as Clausette asks for more details. The princess reveals that the family passes down methods to control their aroma, just as Marquess Eucaliote is seen approaching. A thought bubble near the Marquess reads, Cecilia? Wow. Clausette is amazed, realizing the Crown Prince wasn't making things up, while Roselia thinks about what she's heard. As the Marquess nears, Roselia asks if there's more to the family trait, but the princess is unsure. The three women at the table look up as Marquess Eucaliote arrives. The princess notes she's unsure about the others, but Marquess Eucaliote apologizes for being too forward. FWIP. He turns to leave, but the princess invites him to stay, calling him the famous Marquess everyone has been talking about. Bow. The Marquess bows as the princess offers him a seat, and Roselia privately notes a faint aroma on him. Grin. The princess smiles, insisting that a cup of tea would be no trouble at all. Drag. As the Marquess pulls up a chair, Roselia wonders if his scent is perfume, or the legendary Lefelios bloodline aroma. He thanks the princess and politely greets Lady Roselia, asking how she's been. Roselia smiles warmly, assuring him she has been well, and asking about him in return. Wish, he replies that he's been fine, and is happy to see her again. Grin. Clausette curiously asks Roselia when she became friends with the Marquess. Thinking she might as well discuss her supposed lover, Roselia turns to the Marquis to speak. Brush. Marquis Euclid startles Lady Roselia by touching her hair. Wish. He smells her blossoming aroma, noting she can't yet control it as she nervously questions him. He reveals a small red item from her hair, privately worrying that Cecilia will be in danger if she can't control her aroma. Step. As Duke Balthazar walks away, the Marquise resolves to keep her safe when she blossoms. The Duke pauses, a determined look on his face. Clench. As Closet and Roselia interact with the Marquess, the Duke's fist tightens in the foreground. Closet greets the Marquess's brother, while Roselia offers a formal greeting. Duke Balthazar appears, sternly admonishing them for improperly inviting a guest without his permission. Roselia stands beside the Marquess, looking worried and tense. She inwardly panics, thinking she isn't ready to face the Duke while dressed as a woman. The Duke coldly greets the Marquess, acknowledging their meeting. The two men face each other as Roselia and Closet watch from the side. The Marquess claims Roselia is already committed to spending time with him. Gasp! He boldly declares himself Roselia's lover, stunning both her and Closet. Wink. The Marquess winks, and the Duke internally wonders how he knew about their situation. The Duke requests more respect for Roselia, and the Marquess cheekily agrees, attributing the Duke's concern to his love for her. The Duke warns the Marquess not to provoke him in his own home, but the Marquess retorts that he will always stand up for his lover to ensure her stay is easy. Exasperated, Roselia thinks they're being dramatic, as the Marquess reaffirms his bold stance. Roselia steps between the two men, demanding they stop. Spotting an attendant calling for the Duke, she urges the Marquess to leave and grabs his arm to lead him away as Closet sweats nervously. Roselia and the Marquess share a moment in a warm, ethereal glow. The Marquess waves a polite farewell as he departs with his attendant. Roselia is left standing alone with the Duke in the grand hall. The Duke asks if she had something to discuss, leaving both her and a confused Closet speechless. The Duke stands alone in the sunlit hall, adjusting his glove with a serious expression. Roselia wonders if his melodramatic behavior was just for that, but hesitates to speak her mind. Flinch. She recoils slightly as the Duke gets her attention. Whimper. He tempts her with aged steak, and she mentally pleads with him to stop using sad puppy eyes. With a sigh of resignation, Roselia reluctantly agrees to join him for dinner. A faint blush appears on the Duke's face as he looks on, pleased. The scene shifts to the magnificent Balthazar estate at sunset. Clink. At the dinner table, someone begins cutting a steak. Clink, clink. The Duke, Roselia, and Closet sit in silence at the ends of a vast, empty dining table. Roselia feels suffocated by the tense silence, realizing the lack of drama is its own problem. Thud. Closet slams her hands down, exclaiming that the stifling atmosphere is ruining her appetite. She angrily confronts the Duke, demanding to know why he forced them into this awkward dinner. The Duke calmly ignores her outburst, remarking it's a shame Antonio couldn't join them. Roselia wonders what Antonio is doing, while Closet grumpily assumes he's busy paying off his debt. Glug. As a servant pours him wine, the Duke asks Roselia if the food is to her liking. He offers to have something else prepared, which terrifies Roselia and Closet, who now wonders if he's possessed. The Duke offers to have the chef cook another steak, but Roselia quickly insists that it's good. He expresses his relief, prompting Closet to loudly wonder if he's a spirit possessing her brother. The three remain in their seats at the long, silent table. As the Duke sips his wine, Roselia wonders what has gotten into him lately and how she should respond. A packed suitcase rests on a table in a moonlit room. Overwhelmed, Roselia feels suffocated and wonders about the Duke's strange behavior, deciding to just pack and leave. Clack. As she picks up her suitcase, she notices the Duke standing in the doorway. The Duke, framed by thorny shadows, menacingly asks if she's sure she doesn't want to see her brother. Wish? She turns away, insisting she's fine. As she walks away with her suitcase, she thinks she can see her brother anytime, while the Duke watches her go. The Duke coldly assumes the Marquess won't pay off her debt. Roselia insists her family's debt is her business, not his, but is confused when he asks about her wrist. He steps closer, apologizing for grabbing her wrist too hard and admitting he was only thinking of himself. Noting the smell of alcohol on him, she dismisses his behavior as nothing new. The Duke looks down sadly, quietly agreeing with her assessment. He sincerely asks her to accept his apology, expressing deep regret for his past and present actions. A flashback shows him cruelly asking how much he needed to pay to own her. In his thoughts, he regrets his hurtful words and apologizes. Roselia remains silent, listening to his apology. FWIP. He suddenly pulls her into his arms, confessing he would have paid her debts to keep her from any other man. Stunned by his words, she wonders what he could possibly mean. Looking into his intense gaze, she questions if he could actually be in love with her. The Duke tells Roselia that he doesn't want her to choose the Marquis. Tap. He pins her against the door, leaning in close with her suitcase still in her hand. The two stare into each other's eyes, caught in a tense, intimate moment. Roselia closes her eyes, anticipating a kiss. Snatch! Instead of kissing her, the Duke grabs her suitcase, and she cries out that she has to leave. She clutches her suitcase, confused and flustered by his unpredictable actions. Roselia stands alone in the vast hall, holding her luggage. As she watches him walk away, she wonders if the cold-hearted man could have really changed because of her. Later, sitting alone in the moonlit gardens, she remembers a promise she made to herself. She recalls her vow to never fall for the Duke, but now sits blushing and conflicted. Hugging herself, she tries to convince herself her flushed cheeks are just from the wine. She sits alone in the quiet, expansive courtyard, looking small beneath the night sky. The next day, a conversation begins about events from yesterday. Clausette asks Antonio when the Marquess became his lover, and he nervously says it just happened. He privately admits that he lied to the Duke about being in a relationship with the Marquess. Walking through the gardens, Clausette exclaims that his lie is far too big. She wonders if the Marquess was just playing along, cheekily suggesting he might have a crush on Antonio. Jolt! A shocked Antonio denies it, but Clausette insists, questioning why else the Marquis would be so kind to him. In a cute flashback, a disgusted Antonio thinks, while Claudette tells him not to be so repulsed. Antonio admits the Marquess is handsome, but insists he feels no romantic attraction toward men. Haha, he laughs it off, suggesting the Marquis is just teasing the Duke for fun, unaware the Duke is watching from a balcony above. From a window, the Duke silently observes their conversation. He continues to watch Antonio and Clausette as they walk through the garden below. Antonio smiles, lost in his own thoughts about the situation. The Duke's expression remains serious, while an attendant stands behind him in the study. Jolt! The attendant's voice startles the Duke, pulling him from his thoughts. The Duke turns defensively, denying he was looking at anything when his attendant asks. He lashes out at the attendant, Alejandro, accusing him of sneaking around with too much time on his hands. Alejandro calmly reminds the Duke he was summoned to deliver files, leaving the Duke flustered. Alone with his thoughts, the Duke admits he was staring at Antonio without even realizing it. He grimaces, wondering why Roselia and Antonio look so similar, and why it's confusing him so much. The scene transitions to an elegant mansion under a dark, cloudy night sky. Antonio wishes his grandpa goodnight as the elderly man rests in bed. He smiles gently, watching his grandpa for a moment before leaving. Alone in the hallway, he stretches with a happy and carefree expression. He admits he doesn't want to go home because he can't bear to see Klaus's face. To avoid returning, he decides to tidy up around the mansion a bit more. He enters an office and is shocked to find papers scattered all over the floor. He enters the office and finds a letter from the Escavan naval base addressed to Count Baldro de Verna, which begins with grave news. The letter reveals that the Count's son, Sir Ashton de Vernis, was killed in the line of duty, causing Antonio to cry out for his grandpa in his thoughts.